I don't think you realize how big of a deal Sherlock Holmes is. Yes, today we're going to dive into one of the more classic tales of the pipe-toting detective who lives on 221B Baker Street. But because enough time has passed and enough larger-than-life characters exist today, he feels less substantial in the 21st century, but that instinct is dead wrong. It all started with the actual stories themselves, 56 short stories and 4 novels over the course of 30-plus years. But that was just the beginning. As of the 1990s, so I have no idea where the stat is today, Sherlock Holmes has appeared as a character in over 25,000 stage adaptations, movies, TV shows, and other written publications. He holds the Guinness World Record for the most portrayed human literary character in film and television history. In the time that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote his stories, the fame around Sherlock was so great that globally, there was confusion about if he was a real man or a fictional character. The Abbey National Building Society, which was the real company with the address of 221B Baker Street, had to employ a secretary with the sole job of responding to the thousands of letters sent to Mr. Holmes asking for help with mysteries and personal matters. In nations all over the world, the character of Sherlock Holmes has been retold over and over again, and his archetype has been used to create an endless list of characters that combine the genius levels of astute observation with oftentimes less than social personabilities. Dr. House, Monk, Spock, Sean Spencer, Columbo, Philip Marlowe, Luther, Lupin, Veronica Mars, Scully and Mulder, Doctor Who, Rick Sanchez, Rust Cole, Benoit Blanc, and Batman. Yeah, where do you think they got the archetype for the world's greatest detective? Not only is he the most portrayed and copied character in literary history, he was also the very first character with his own universe to be so well loved that he inspired a fandom. Yes, Comic-Con owes its roots to the groups of people who identified so much with Sherlock Holmes that they met together, dressed up like the detective, or shared their own fan fictions. Whatever level of knowledge or respect you had for the fictional man is simply not enough. So hopefully this episode can help start you down your road to repentance so you can become a loyal fan of Mr. Sherlock Holmes like you should be. Luckily, almost all his tales are short stories, so it should be easier for you to dive right in. Today, we're introducing him to the BTMC universe by way of one of the spookiest tales he has ever appeared in. A perfect way to kick off our October season here on the show. So grab your deerstalker cap. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that's what it's called, but you know exactly what I'm talking about because he made that hat that famous. So grab your deerstalker cap and let's dive in to the Hound of the Baskervilles. Dr. John Watson was standing by the fire. Wait, you know what? This just doesn't feel quite right. That's more like it. All right, let's start again. Dr. John H. Watson was standing by the fireplace as a very out-of-sorts Sherlock Holmes picked at his plate of breakfast. Sherlock was never one for early mornings, unless, of course, he had failed to go to bed the previous night. "Well, Watson," he asked, almost irritably, "what do you make of it?" Watson was holding a walking stick that had been left at the front door by a visitor sometime during the early morning. How had Sherlock known that he'd picked up the stick? Watson had often found reason to believe his friend had eyes in the back of his head. He said as much aloud, and Sherlock just said that what he does have is a very well-polished coffee pot in front of him. "What do you make of the stick?" Sherlock repeated. "I want you to reconstruct the man who owns it from what you can deduce." Sherlock wanted to test his pupil. Watson sighed and looked at the stick again more closely this time. It was a solid stick of wood adorned with silver bands and a bulbous metal head at the end. Engraved on it were the words, "To James Mortimer, MRCS, from his friends of the CCH, 1884. "I'd say he's a well-esteemed older man of medicine," Watson said after a pause. "I'd guess he's a country practitioner based on how worn the stick is. It's been used for many miles. Far too worn down for a town practitioner." "Perfectly sound," Sherlock belted without turning his head. "Go on." "This friends of the CCH makes me think it must be some Local hunting group. Possibly the members of the group gave it to him in return for some surgical services he provided them. I must say, Watson, you excel yourself, Holmes said as he finally pushed his chair back from the breakfast table and walked towards his friend. I am bound to say that in all the accounts which you have been so good as to give of my own small achievements, you have habitually underrated your own abilities. It may be that you are not luminous yourself, but you are a conductor of light. Some people, without possessing genius, have a remarkable power of stimulating it. I confess, my dear fellow, that I am very much in your debt. Watson managed to focus on the first part of that statement that came across as a compliment. He had worked very hard to bring the public eye to the genius achievements of Sherlock, and this was the first time Holmes had ever actually said anything good or bad about his efforts. He took this as an endorsement of his hypothesis about the stick. Sherlock took the stick himself and examined it. Watson asked if any details had escaped him. He trusted he hadn't missed anything important. I am afraid, my dear Watson, that most of your conclusions were erroneous. Watson's smile fell into a resentful sneer. When I said you stimulated, I meant, to be frank, that in noting your fallacies, I was occasionally guided towards the truth. Holmes goes on to say Watson hadn't been entirely wrong. This man is most certainly a country practitioner. Well, that means I was mostly right, Watson said defensively. Sherlock tilted his head with a grimace. You also said the CCH was a hunting club, when it is much more likely a hospital. Charing Cross Hospital seems to suggest itself. You may be right, Watson relented. The probabilities lie in that direction, Holmes said unfazed. Anything else you picked up? Watson asked. You know my methods, Sherlock said, pushing it back on his friend. You give it another go. The only thing I know for certain is that he is a country doctor. Holmes sighed once he realized Watson couldn't piece together anything else on his own. Let's think about what kind of occasion someone would be gifted such an item as this. It seems obvious this stick was given to Dr. Mortimer when he withdrew from his time of service at Charing Cross. That's very possible, Watson said, and we can assume he was not actually on staff at Charing Cross, as only a well-established London doctor would be staffed there, and no one in that position would leave the city for a country practice. Watson shifted his weight impatiently, which told Holmes the doctor wanted him to get to the point. Most likely he was a senior student there, and this is dated only 5 years ago, meaning he is not an old man, a not-so-old man who apparently has a favorite dog, larger than a terrier, smaller than a mastiff. Yes, I'd venture a guess that we are dealing with a man 30 or under, amiable, unambitious, and absent-minded. Watson wanted to be annoyed with Sherlock, but he was always amazed when he witnessed one of these episodes. He laughed in unsurprised incredulity as Holmes leaned back into a chair and lit up his pipe. Watson knew he could verify at least one aspect of that using Holmes's medical dictionary of England. He found several Mortimers, but only one that could fit the description. Quote, Mortimer James, MRCS 1882, Grimpen, Dartmoor, Devon, house surgeon, from 1882 to 1884 at Charing Cross Hospital, winner of the Jackson Prize for Comparative Pathology with essay entitled Is Disease a Reversion? Corresponding member of the Swedish You know what, it keeps going. Just imagine a bunch of fictional medical achievements. I didn't hear any mention of that local hunt, Holmes said with a sinister smile. What were the words I used? Amiable, unambitious, and absent-minded? Only an amiable man would receive testimonials such as those. Only an unambitious one would settle for a country practice instead of working for placement here in London. And only an absent-minded one would leave his stick on my door. But why did you say he had a dog? Look at the teeth marks, plainly visible around the middle of the stick. The animal has obviously carried this thing in its mouth many a time. The spread of the teeth marks is, as I said, larger than a terrier, smaller than a mastiff. Holmes had stood up and paced at the window with his pipe. Yes, in fact, I'm positive it must be a curly-haired spaniel. Watson rolled his eyes. How could you possibly be sure of its breed from that? Holmes, who was leaning towards the window, peering down into the street, said, Because it's on our doorstep right now. The doorbell rattled, and there is the ring of its owner calling to us. Sherlock was excited, not necessarily about meeting the man, but to see if he had been 100% correct about who he was. Now is the dramatic moment of fate, Watson, when you hear a step upon the stair which is walking into your life, and you know not whether for good or ill, What does Dr. James Mortimer, man of science, ask of Sherlock Holmes, the specialist in crime? Come in! Watson watched as a tall, thin man with a large beak of a nose that stood between two gray eyes walked in through the door. He was dressed in professional but kind of unfashionable clothing, trousers frayed and a dingy coat, his back already bowed like that of a man 30 years his senior. The man's eyes lit up as he saw Sherlock holding his stick. I am so very glad. I was not sure if I'd left it here or at the shipping office. I would not lose that stick for the world, he said. I presume it was a gift, Sherlock said, looking sideways at Watson with a smug look on his face. Yes, sir, Dr. Mortimer replied. From Charing Cross Hospital, Holmes asked, still pulling a face at Watson since the guest was still preoccupied looking over his recovered treasure. From a couple of friends I had there at the time of my marriage. Sherlock's brow furrowed. Oh, he said, that's bad, shaking his head. Mortimer blinked in confusion. Why is that bad, he asked. Oh, not your marriage, Holmes assured him, just that you have dispelled our little deductions about you. Oh, I see, Mortimer chuckled with relief. Yes, see, I left the hospital at the time of my marriage to start a home of my own. A smile of relief came over Sherlock's face as he realized that he was actually closer to the mark than the last statement had made him believe. We were not so wrong after all, he said to Watson. Now, Dr. Mortimer. Oh, just Mr., the guest said, a humble MRCS. MRCS stands for Member of the Royal College of Surgeons. It wasn't the same thing as being a physician, but it was a certification of sorts that qualified him to do surgical work. Mr. Mortimer, who everyone in the book refers to him as doctor the rest of the time, so we're just going to call him Dr. Mortimer as well, despite his protest. But Dr. Mortimer said that he was so excited to meet Holmes, and that he hadn't expected to see such a dolichocephalic skull with such well-marked supraorbital development on the mastermind detective. This is how we learned that Mortimer was a student of phrenology, a now unpopular but once very popular study of the size and shape of the skull, believing that bumps and other little indicators could lead to understanding something about a person's intellectual abilities. So in plain English, what he just told Holmes when he said a dolichocephalic skull with such a well-marked supraorbital development was, I hadn't expected such a long, narrow head on such prominent brow ridges. He then asks if he can run his finger along his head and that a cast of the detective's skull, until the original is available, would be an ornament in any anthropological museum. I must confess, I covet your skull, he said. Well, isn't that nice, Sherlock said with a slightly displeased look on his face. And I observe from your forefinger that you roll your own tobacco. Feel free to light one up now. The country doctor pulled out a paper and tobacco and twirled up a cigarette with surprising dexterity. As the visitor struck a match, Holmes inquired that he assumed the doctor has more of a reason to visit than to just covet his cranium. Oh, of course I do, Mortimer said. I'm facing an extraordinary problem, and I came to you seeing how you are the second highest expert in Europe. Holmes shook his head quickly as if shocked. May I ask who is considered the first? Well, in this specific field, Monsieur Bertillon must be considered the greatest mind. FYI, Alphonse Bertillon was a real French criminologist who pioneered many methods in identifying criminals, including the mugshot. So mentioning him here was a way of Doyle tipping his hat to a real criminal mastermind, while also hinting that this matter may have something to do with forensics specifically. Holmes tilted his nose away from the guest in mild agitation and asked if Mortimer hadn't better consult with Bertillon himself. Mortimer quickly corrected the misunderstanding, saying that although there are aspects of forensics involved, Holmes is the best man when it comes to practical affairs and general detective work. Still sensing he'd hurt the detective's pride, Mortimer began to ask, I trust that I have not inadvertently, just a little, Holmes cut him off. Let's just get to the point, Dr. Mortimer. Tell us why you're here. Dr. Mortimer then pulled out a manuscript dated 1742. It had come to him by way of Sir Charles Baskerville, who died 3 months before in Devonshire. Mortimer's face looked sad as he described Sir Charles as a close friend, a man with a strong mind, and as unimaginative as anyone he'd ever met. Yet Sir Charles had taken this document very seriously. He shows the paper to Holmes and says it is a legend that is passed down through the Baskerville family about their own history. Mortimer is clear that the reason he is here is a current matter, something that must be decided within 24 hours, in fact, but in order for them to understand his request, they need to hear this statement. Holmes leaned back in his chair, elbows on the armrests, hands up with fingertips touching. And he closed his eyes, resigning himself to the fact he would have to indulge the doctor. Mortimer then read aloud. Many versions have been told of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles, but as I am descended directly from Hugo Baskerville and heard the tale from my father as he did from his, I set it down here as truth. Believe, my sons, that the same justice which punishes sin may also graciously forgive it, and that no curse is so heavy it cannot be lifted through prayer and repentance. Let this story teach you not to dread the past, but to be watchful in the future, so that the foul passions which have so long tormented our family may not again be unleashed to our ruin. In the time of the Great Rebellion, about which Lord Clarendon had written so well, this manor of Baskerville was held by one Hugo of that name, a man wild, profane, and godless. This the neighbors might have endured, for saints are rare in these parts. But there was in him a cruelty and reckless humor that made his name infamous throughout the West. It happened that Hugo became enamored, if such dark desire deserves so bright a name, of the daughter of a yeoman whose land bordered Baskervilles. But the maiden, being virtuous and sensible, always avoided him, for she feared his wicked reputation. One Michaelmas, by the way, if you're not familiar with Michaelmas, it is a traditional Christian feast day for the Archangel Michael that falls on the 29th of September. So we just had one a couple days ago. When her father and brothers were away, Hugo and several of his riotous companions seized the girl and carried her off to the hall. She was locked in an upstairs chamber while Hugo and his friends drank heavily below, filling the night with shouting and blasphemy. The poor girl, half mad with terror, did a thing that might have daunted even the bravest man. By the help of the ivy growing thick upon the south wall, she climbed down from under the eaves and fled across the moor towards her father's farm, 3 leagues away. Later, Hugo went to bring her food and drink, perhaps worse, and found her gone. At this, he flew into a frenzy as if possessed. He stormed into the dining hall, leapt upon the great table, scattering cups and platters, and cried before all that he would give his body and soul to the powers of evil if he might only overtake the girl that night. One of his companions, whether more wicked or more drunk, shouted that they should set the hounds upon her. At once, Hugo called for his mare to be saddled and the hounds released, tossing them a kerchief of the maidens to scent. Then he galloped out into the moonlit moor, the pack baying behind. For a moment, the company stood in shock, but soon enough, their wits returned and they too mounted their horses, 13 in all, and set off in pursuit. After a mile or two, they met a shepherd on the moor and called out if he had seen the chase. The man, pale with fear, stammered that he had seen the maiden, the hounds close upon her, and Hugo riding on his black mare. "But I saw more than that," he whispered. Behind him ran a great black beast, a hound from hell itself. God forbid it should ever follow me. They cursed him for a fool and rode on, but their courage soon faltered, for the black mare soon passed them, lathered with foam, in saddle empty and reins trailing. Close together now and sobered by dread, they pressed on until they came to a narrow ravine where the hounds had gathered. These fierce beasts, known for their courage, were whining in terror, some slinking away, others staring with hackles raised into the hollow below. 3 of the boldest or most reckless rode down. In a clearing lit by the full moon, they saw the maiden's body, dead of fear and exhaustion, and near her, the corpse of Hugo Baskerville. But it was not these sights that froze their blood. Over Hugo's body crouched a foul thing, black as night, larger than any earthly hound, its jaws red with his blood. As the creature raised its blazing eyes and snarling mouth toward them, the men shrieked in horror and fled across the moor. One died that very night of the terror, and the other 2 lived broken men. Such, my sons, is the tale of the coming of the hound that has plagued our family ever since. I write it down because what is plainly known has less terror than what is only whispered. And though many of our line have met violent and mysterious deaths, still we may trust in the mercy of Providence, which does not punish beyond the third or fourth generation. To that Providence I commend you, and I caution you to never cross the moor at night, when the powers of evil walk abroad. Written by Hugo Baskerville to his sons Roger and John, with instructions that it not be shared with their sister, Elizabeth. When he finished, Dr. Mortimer peered through his glasses to see Holmes's reaction. The detective was yawning as he tossed a cigarette into the fireplace. "Did you not find it interesting?" the doctor asked. "To a collector of fairy tales," was Sherlock's blunt reply. The doctor was unfazed, however, and said now he could share the more current news. This one is a news article from May 14th of the current year. It's an account of the death of Sir Charles. With that, Sherlock leaned forward. Quote, "The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville, whose name has been mentioned as the probable Liberal candidate for Mid-Devon at the next election, has cast a gloom over the county. Though Sir Charles had resided at Baskerville Hall for a comparatively short period, his amiability of character and extreme generosity had won the affection and respect of all who had been brought into contact with him. In these days of nouveau riche, it is refreshing to find a case where the scion of an old county family which has fallen upon evil days is able to make his own fortune and to bring it back with him to restore the fallen grandeur of his line. Sir Charles, as is well known, made large sums of money in South African speculation. More wise than those who go on until the wheel turns against them, he realized his gains and returned to England with them. It is only 2 years since he took up his residence at Baskerville Hall, and it is common talk how large were those schemes of reconstruction and improvement which have been interrupted by his death. Being himself childless, it was his openly expressed desire that the whole county side should, within his own lifetime, profit by his good fortune. And many will have personal reasons for bewailing his untimely end. His generous donations to local and county charities have been frequently chronicled in these columns. The circumstances connected with the death of Sir Charles cannot be said to have been entirely cleared up by the inquest, but at least enough has been done to dispose of any rumors to which local superstition has given rise. There is no reason whatsoever to suspect foul play, or to imagine that death could be from any but natural causes. Sir Charles was a widower and a man who may be said to have been in some ways of an eccentric habit of mind. In spite of his considerable wealth, he was simple in his personal tastes, and his indoor servants at Baskerville Hall consisted of a married couple named Barrymore, the husband acting as butler and the wife as housekeeper. Their evidence, corroborated by that of several friends, tends to show that Sir Charles's health has for some time been impaired, and points especially to some affection of the heart, manifesting itself in changes of color, breathlessness, and acute attacks of nervous depression. Dr. James Mortimer, the friend and medical attendant of the deceased, has given evidence to the same effect. The facts of the case are simple. Sir Charles Baskerville was in the habit every night before going to bed of walking down the famous yew alley of Baskerville Hall. The evidence of the Barrymores shows that this had been his custom. On the 4th of May, Sir Charles had declared his intention of starting next day for London, and had ordered Barrymore to prepare his luggage. That night, he went out as usual for his nocturnal walk, in the course of which he was in the habit of smoking a cigar. He never returned. At 12 o'clock, Barrymore, finding the hall door still open, became alarmed, and lighting a lantern, went in search of his master. The day had been wet, and Sir Charles's footmarks were easily traced down the alley. Halfway down this walk, there is a gate which leads out onto the moor. There were indications that Sir Charles had stood there for some time. He then proceeded down the alley, and it was at the far end of it that his body was discovered. One fact which has not been explained is the statement of Barrymore that his master's footprints altered their character from the time that he passed the moor gate, and that he appeared from thence onward to have been walking upon his toes. One Murphy, a gypsy horse dealer, was on the moor at no great distance at the time, but he appears by his own confession to have been the worse for drink. He declares that he heard cries, but is unable to state from what direction they came. No signs of violence were to be discovered upon Sir Charles's person, and though the doctor's evidence pointed to an almost incredible facial distortion, so great that Dr. Mortimer refused at first to believe that it was indeed his friend and patient who lay before him, it was explained that that is a symptom which is not unusual in deaths related to cardiac exhaustion. This explanation was borne out by the post-mortem examination, which showed long-standing organic disease and the coroner's jury returned a verdict in accordance with the medical evidence. It is well that it is so, for it is obviously of the utmost importance that Sir Charles's heir should settle at the Hall and continue the good work which has been so sadly interrupted. Had the prosaic finding of the coroner not finally put an end to the romantic stories which have been whispered in connection with the affair, it may have been difficult to find a tenant for Baskerville Hall. It is understood that the next of kin is Mr. Henry Baskerville, if he be still alive." End quote. I know that's a lot, but it just felt to me like it allows you a better chance of being a detective through the story if you hear those entire accounts, because they set the basis for the whole story. "Those are the public facts in connection to the death of Sir Charles," Mortimer added. Sherlock, with a smirk, thanked the doctor for bringing him a case that was at least interesting, and then said if those were the public facts, let him hear the private ones. Before sharing those private facts, Mortimer makes it clear that no one has heard these facts. The reason he didn't share them with the investigators was that he didn't think they were of merit to men of science or law, because they seemed to endorse a superstition. He also didn't want to feed the already grim reputation that Baskerville Hall had. He begins by saying that with so few men who lived on the moor, he mentions a Mr. Frankland and Mr. Stapleton as the only other neighbors, Dr. Mortimer quickly grew close with Sir Charles when he'd moved to Baskerville Hall a few short years ago. Both were men of science with interest in anthropology, but in the months leading up to the old man's death, Mortimer had noticed his nervous system appeared to be at its breaking point. The doctor assumes it had something to do with the legend because Sir Charles became increasingly isolated and would never set foot out of the grounds of his own estate after dark. He also remembers arriving at the estate one night a few weeks before the death. Sir Charles greeted him outside, but well within the grounds of his own home, mind you, and as Mortimer walked up to greet his friend, he noticed that Sir Charles's eyes were fixed on something over the doctor's shoulder, towards the gate to the long drive of the hall. Mortimer whipped his head around just in time to see what looked like a large black calf bolting out of view. Sir Charles was shaken by the event, and it was that night when the baronet explained to the doctor about the legend of the hall. Jumping forward to the night of the death, Mortimer said he was on the scene within an hour of when Barrymore had discovered his master dead in the yew alley, which, by the way, since we don't exactly have yew alleys in our modern environments, just imagine a large European estate with massive grounds and an alley formed by 2 rows of massive but well-trimmed hedged trees. So although not a creepy alley full of trash like you'd expect in a city, at night it would still feel like a dark and confined space. Mortimer was led to the body, and the doctor noted that along the way, the only footsteps other than Sir Charles's were those of Barrymore from when he discovered the corpse. Sir Charles was stretched out on the ground. His fingers had clawed in front of him, but what shook the doctor the most was how distorted the man's face was, so wretched, with a look of terror, that he may not have recognized him had he not known it was his friend beforehand. There were no signs of physical injury, and as Barrymore pointed out, there were no visible prints around the body to suggest an altercation. Mortimer then lowered his voice as he told Holmes and Watson that he did observe something that Barrymore had not. A little distance from the body, he did find a set of prints that the butler had failed to notice. "A man or a woman's?" Holmes asked. The doctor's face tensed up as if he'd been dreading this moment, but in a whisper, he finally said, "Mr. Holmes, they were the prints of a gigantic hound." Before we keep going, I want to point out something I observed about why this premise feels so eerie. If we were to hear a story about a hound, but there was no physical evidence to a hound being involved, we'd naturally assume this is just a human up to no good using the story of a spectral hound as the monster to fixate people's fear around. Or as another example, if this was a story about a human ghost, how many stories have we heard before that ended up being just a trick played by someone who wanted to frighten the subject? Like every Scooby-Doo episode ever. But a human can't pretend to be a demon dog with fire in its eyes. And now we've had a couple pieces of supposed first-hand testimony to the physical existence of the hound. Mortimer saw what he thought was a large black calf shape with his own eyes, and he swears to finding massive prints of a dog near the body. And in my observation at least, the reason this is so much creepier is because a human we can assign motive or malintent to, but a monstrous dog We can't really conceive why it would A, exist, and B, be so intent on hunting down the descendants of a single family. So it's kind of the combination of it being a story with a creature that we can't conceive of its existence, and it can't just be faked by a human wearing a costume, paired with the first-hand accounts that might back up the theory that it just makes it so much more unsettling than if, say, it was just a human murderer. And then you mix in all the details like the frozen look of horror on Sir Charles's face and the detailed and gruesome account from the legend itself, and, well, our minds can do the rest for us. We have so many questions in this case that we need answers to. Holmes squinted as if unbelieving of what the doctor had just said. "You saw this?" he pressed the doctor. "As clearly as I see you," he replied. "But no one else did. The marks were over 50 feet from the body, so nobody else was looking that far. I wouldn't have if it weren't for my knowledge of the legend. Are there many sheepdogs on the moor, Doctor? I assure you this was no sheepdog, too massive, but it had not approached the body." "No." He then explains that the yew alley is packed with 12-foot tall trees, which are so closely planted they are impenetrable. The path between the rows is about 8 feet wide, with rows of grass 6 feet wide on either side, so the total width of the alley is about 20 feet. And the only access points are the two ends of the long alley, and then in the middle there is a small wicket gate that leads out onto the moor. And Sherlock makes a point of asking if the Hound prints were inside the grounds, which Mortimer says they were, despite the wicket gate being closed and locked. But the gate itself is only about 4 feet high, so that doesn't mean it's completely inaccessible. And the last detail that Mortimer has to share is that it appears Sir Charles had been standing in front of the gate for some time, based on the number of nervous-looking footprints in the gravel right next to the gate, as well as the amount of cigar ashes that were present. Holmes began to pester the doctor about how he should have brought him in on this case months ago when it was fresh, but Mortimer says he couldn't have called the famous Sherlock Holmes in on a case without these details being made public. Plus, he wasn't sure if it would be of any use to bring in a detective on a case that seemed possibly out of the realm of science. "You mean you think this is a supernatural hound?" Sherlock asked with a raised eyebrow. "I do not positively say so," the doctor replied defensively. "No, but you evidently think it," Holmes said. Mortimer explains that in the months before the death, there had been 3 witnesses on the moor who claimed to have seen a demon dog. They were all practical, grizzled men who were not quick to be taken by ghost stories, but they all described it in the same way: a ghastly, luminous hound of incredible size. It has now got the entire district afraid to travel by night, so Mortimer says he simply doesn't know what to make of it. Holmes jokes that to this point he's contained his investigations to the material world, and admittedly to take on the father of evil would be too much even for him, but the fact that there were physical prints found means that, to his logic, this dog is not completely spiritual in nature. He then asks the doctor why he has come if he means to make the detective believe this is a supernatural matter, and the doctor finally reveals he's not here because he's trying to catch a ghost hound. He's here because he is the executor of the old man's estate, and he has come to London to pick up the heir to Baskerville Hall, Sir Henry Baskerville. But with such a chaotic mystery surrounding the moor, he doesn't know what to do. We learn that Sir Henry had lived most of his life abroad, and at the time of Sir Charles's death, young Henry, who we believe is about 30 years old, was farming in Canada. Every account the doctor has been able to find of the man indicates he is an excellent fellow. Holmes asked if there were other possible claimants to the inheritance, and Mortimer says Charles only had 2 brothers. The second brother, who is already dead, was the father to Henry. The youngest sibling to Charles, Roger, was the black sheep of the family. He was too much like Hugo of old, both in temperament and appearance, and he fled to Central America, where it was reported he had died of yellow fever some 15 years ago. It was not believed that he had had any children. Holmes tried to sum up why the doctor was there. "So, put into plain words, the matter is this," he said. "In your opinion, there is a diabolical agency which makes Dartmoor an unsafe abode for a Baskerville. That is your opinion?" The doctor says he feels like he has plenty of reason to at least consider the possibility. Holmes jokes that if it is supernatural, then the question shouldn't be limited to if it's safe to take Henry to Baskerville Hall, After all, a devil with geographic limitations is too inconceivable of a thing. Mortimer stomped his foot at the levity. You put the matter more flippantly, Mr. Holmes, than you would probably do if you were brought into personal contact with these things. Holmes doesn't apologize, but he does accept that it was rude to make light of a matter the doctor was taking so seriously. He advises the doctor to pick up Henry, have a day on the town, and then the two of them return to Baker Street the next morning at 10 a.m. Holmes will have his thoughts in order by then. The doctor thanked him, and as he left, Sherlock asked a clarifying question. You say 3 reports of seeing the dog have occurred before the death. Any since? Not that I have heard of, the doctor said. Holmes just nodded his head and turned back from the door. He was about to enter his deep think mode. With Dr. Mortimer gone, Dr. Watson makes to leave as well, and Sherlock asks him to stop by the store down the street and have them send up a pound of their strongest tobacco. And also, he asks Watson to return by the evening. Until then, he has plenty to stew over with this most interesting problem. The next statement is a quote from Watson. I knew that seclusion and solitude were very necessary for my friend in those hours of intense mental concentration during which he weighed every particle of evidence, constructed alternative theories, balanced one against the other, and made up his mind as to which points were essential and which immaterial. I therefore spent the day at my club and did not return to Baker Street until evening. When Watson got back that evening, he opened the door to so much smoke he was positive a fire had broken out. But it turned out to just be Holmes and his vortex of thought, so consumed by the mystery that he hadn't opened a window while he puffed away. Holmes was in his dressing gown, coiled up in his chair, rolls of paper all around him. Watson coughed at the smoke, and Holmes absent-mindedly asked if he'd caught a cold. When Sherlock correctly predicts that Watson had been at his men's club all day without even looking up at him, Watson, who is perhaps the most familiar with the man's genius, still couldn't help but ask if it was that obvious. Quote, the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. There are several banger lines in this book, but this one is one of my favorites. I'll say that again. The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Watson then asks if Sherlock has been a fixture in that chair all day. Quite the contrary. I have been to Devonshire. Watson, not surprised by this statement, but knowing that was a physical impossibility, just said, in spirit? That was exactly what Sherlock had meant. He jokes that he regrets to note that in his absence, his body had consumed 2 large pots of coffee and consumed an incredible amount of tobacco. Here's the rundown of the things he had reasoned during that time. First, he'd found maps that located a semi-detailed display of the Baskerville estate, enough to show where the yew alley was in relation to the moor. He'd also located the houses of the neighbors that had been mentioned, Dr. Mortimer, Mr. Stapleton, Mr. Frankland. Other than that, there were only a few farmhouses spread far and wide, but 14 miles away was the prison of Princetown. Sherlock offhandedly comments that if the devil did desire to have a hand in the affairs of men, this is where he would do it. When Watson, surprised, asks if that meant he is considering a supernatural explanation, he just says that the devil may have agents of flesh and blood. But the first puzzle to solve is if a crime has even been committed, or if it is just the unfortunate death of a wealthy old man. But, Sherlock said, we are bound to exhaust all other hypotheses before falling back upon this one. Watson then asked the one thing that had been puzzling him all day, the claim that Sir Charles had been walking on his toes at the end. Sherlock looked disappointedly at his friend, as if that should have been a very obvious fact. Just because some idiot described him as walking on his toes doesn't mean that's what happened, Watson. He was running for his life, running desperately until his heart burst and he fell dead to the ground. The question, Sherlock put it, is who was he waiting for that night at the gate? You certain he was waiting for someone? Watson asked. He was an old man with poor health who was terrified of the legends of evil dogs at night. Why else would he be standing by an exterior gate to his estate at night, if not for some sort of rendezvous? Just because he went for a walk every evening, I highly doubt he had a habit of standing by the wicket gate for a period of time. But that is all we can know for now. Let's wait until our meeting with Mortimer and Sir Henry tomorrow. When they met Sir Henry Baskerville the next morning, he is described as such, quote, A small, alert, dark-eyed man of about 30 years of age, very sturdily built with thick black eyebrows and a strong, pugnacious face. He wore a ruddy-tinted tweed suit and had the weather-beaten appearance of one who has spent most of his time in the open air. And yet, there was something in his steady eye and the quiet assurance of his bearing which indicated the gentleman. Henry, who spoke with a North American accent, stated that even if Mortimer hadn't proposed coming here this morning, he had his own reason for seeking out the detective, and then placed a gray envelope addressed to Sir Henry Baskerville, Northumberland Hotel on the table. No one knew he was going to be staying there. Inside was a half sheet of paper that had been almost exclusively made up of words cut from a newspaper. The message said, quote, "As you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." Moor was the only handwritten word. Mortimer began talking to Holmes in a way that makes it clear to Sir Henry that these men have discussed much without him and he wants in on it. Sherlock assures him that he won't leave this place without knowing everything that he knows, and then asks Watson to hand him the Times from yesterday that's sitting in the corner. Holmes begins to ask the men in the room what they thought of the article about free trade. Citing a lengthy paragraph, all others are confused at the seeming change of topic until Sherlock sighs heavily, realizing that nobody, not even Watson, who knows his little games, picked up on what he was getting at. The paragraph he had quoted included all of the words from the mysterious note that had been delivered to Sir Henry, meaning it had been cut from yesterday's Times. Watson felt sheepish that he hadn't picked up on the clue, but the other two men were completely dumbstruck by the performance from the great detective. He points out that Moor was obviously handwritten because it's not a very common word to be in the paper. Mortimer expresses his amazement that Holmes knew exactly what paper instantly, and Sherlock's rebuttal is to ask if the doctor could tell the skull of an Alaskan Inuit from that of an African. The doctor said, certainly, that is his special hobby. Well, this is my special hobby, Holmes said. The fonts between the Times or the local evening paper are as distinguishable as the differences in skulls to the doctor. As far as knowing it was the issue from the day before, that was simply a probability based on the fact that the letter had been delivered the night before. Mortimer came back to the matter at hand and asks who might have sent it, who might have been wanting to keep Henry from Baskerville Hall. Ah, Sherlock said, we are coming now rather into the region of guesswork, into the region where we balance probabilities and choose the most likely. Sherlock further deduces by the scratchy stroke marks on the envelope that it was likely a publicly used pen like one at a hotel, and that the writing on the envelope also seemed to be written hastily, implying the sender was in a hurry. But other than that, he can deduce nothing at this point, and asks Sir Henry if anything else has happened to him since arriving in England. Well, I don't know much about British customs yet, he said with his North American accent, but I hope to lose one of your boots is not part of the routine of life here. At Holmes's inquiry, we learned that Henry and Mortimer had gone shopping the day before after he'd arrived to buy clothes more suitable for a squire. But one of the boots seemed to have been misplaced before he even put it on his foot. It seems a singularly useless thing to steal, Sherlock thought out loud. But Henry said he was still waiting to be filled in on all the shared details between the doctor and the detective. So Holmes tells Mortimer it's time to fill the baronet in on all the legend and details around his uncle's death. After everything, Henry's face was solemn and puzzled looking. He says he'd heard stories about the Hound since he was a kid, but he'd never taken it very seriously before. And now, with the letter at the hotel, it sure feels like something is up. As Henry soaks all this in, Holmes seems a little giddy, and he thanks the doctor for bringing him a case that is quite the mystery to solve. The letter added a whole new level of intrigue. When asked what he intends to do, Henry, who possessed a bit of what you'd maybe call cowboy bravery, said no devil in hell or man on earth could keep him from going home to his lands and his people, no matter the threats posed to him. Sherlock said if that's the case, that's exactly what he should do. Henry says he needs some time to process all this and asks if Holmes and Watson won't join them for lunch later, and then he and Mortimer descend to the street and start walking through London. As soon as the door had shut, Holmes leapt into action and told Watson to come with him. They were going to follow the baronet in secret. And as soon as they were on the street at a safe distance behind, Sherlock pointed out the reason for tailing them. There was a horse-drawn cab that was slowly clopping its way down the street behind Sir Henry. They worked their way up to try and get a look inside, but all Watson noticed was a black bushy beard before the passenger spotted them, threw up the shutter to the window, and yelled at the driver to take off. They tried to run after it, but they couldn't keep up. Holmes curses himself for being so stupid as to not just follow the cab until he could learn more of its intent. He tells Watson that he will have to make sure to write this down in his tales along with all of his successes. In light of this development, Holmes sends out 2 inquiries to try and learn more about this stalker with a beard, which he assumes is a false one intended to conceal identity. First, he had managed to memorize the license number of the cab, 2704, so he will have the driver sent for. And secondly, they step into a messenger station and ask for Cartwright, a 14-year-old errand runner who had served Holmes well on previous occasions. To him, Sherlock gave enough money to bribe employees at every one of 23 hotels around where Henry was staying. The mission was to get access to their wastebaskets and look for a copy of the Times where the article in question would be cut up. Cartwright is to report by wire that evening what he has learned, and the boy took off. Sherlock was having more and more fun with this case. Okay, I have one takeaway I want to share already, and I think it's one that feels so simple, it feels kind of stupid, but it really is what sets Sherlock apart from the rest of us emotionally driven humans. Most people assume Holmes just knows things. In reality, he often doesn't know. He treats problems as probability puzzles. He runs through every possible explanation he can think of. Then he assigns weight to what's most likely given the evidence. That's what gives him an edge. While others get stuck on one theory, Holmes keeps multiple options in play until the most probable one rises above the rest. If one theory is proven wrong, he's already got the next most likely theory in the chamber. Think back to the opening chapter when they're discussing the origin of the stick, and he said at one point, quote, "The probability lies in that direction." He's not guaranteeing anything. He's simply playing what he believes to be the greatest odds. But he stands out because most of us suffer from something called selective attention. Let's be honest with ourselves, our brains are incapable of processing everything around us. We literally can't take it all in because we only have 2 eyeballs. But also, our mind would run out of juice trying to process all the information we can technically see. So we have naturally conditioned ourselves to only pay attention to the things we think matter. And for the most part, that serves us well. I don't notice the unimportant things, so my brain has the energy to focus on what I do deem important. But that does mean we miss out on a lot of things. Think of the famous invisible gorilla video, where you are prepped before watching the video that you're going to see people passing a ball around, and you're asked to try and count how many passes are made. Since you are so focused on counting the passes, what you fail to see is that a man in a gorilla suit walks onto the screen, beats his chest, and walks off. On rewatching it, it's so obvious, but your mind was tasked with counting passes, so it tried to filter out anything unrelated to that. Sherlock's mind, however, is much more open to the idea that anything might be important. So he takes as much in as possible and filters out the unnecessary stuff very quickly based on the probabilities he can assign to them. So whether it's noticing when a date loses interest in getting to know you, or spotting if the car behind you isn't slowing down enough at the stoplight, your life is full of situations where your default is going to be to use selective attention because it's exhausting to always be noticing everything. Holmes is portrayed as kind of being always on, but I guarantee someone of his skill would still be more alert at a crime scene than walking to their local tobacco shop. Superhuman levels of awareness and intelligent observation is as simple as being aware of more than your default setting and being able to assign probabilities to give you the most likely scenario. I asked AI to give me a specific scenario to illustrate this, and I'm pretty pleased with what it gave me. Say you walk into your home and you see immediately that the window is smashed. What goes through your head? Burglary? A kid throwing a ball? A big old bird? But immediately, you begin to observe things. Your laptop was sitting on a table close to the window, and it's still there. The idea of burglary goes down because visible valuables are still there. Then you notice that the pieces of glass have exploded outward into the yard instead of inside. And all of a sudden, despite not knowing exactly what happened, the highest probability becomes that your child who you left at home got up to some mischief and needs a talking to. That is a more chill example of how Sherlock's brain works all the time, just at a much higher level. It's not a skill you can manage to use all the time the same way that even elite runners can't literally run everywhere every day, but it is a skill you can choose to consciously employ when the circumstances indicate it would be useful. The next chapter has some very interesting details to not miss out on, but they can be summarized rather succinctly. Holmes looks through the register at Henry's hotel, but notices nothing out of the ordinary. While he was browsing the list, Henry came downstairs looking angry, saying that yet another of his boots had gone missing. But not the pair to the one that was already missing. This was from one of his old boots he'd brought with him. A hotel employee is assuring the squire that they'll find his boots, and he says that if they don't, he'll go to a different hotel. Over lunch, Holmes mentions the bearded man in the cab and asks Mortimer if anyone in the moor had a full beard. He said that Barrymore, the butler, did, and Holmes decides to see if Barrymore is actually at the estate and has a telegram sent, cleverly just asking if everything is ready for Henry's arrival. But it's the delivery method that will be useful. It's sent with specific instructions to only deliver it into the hand of Barrymore himself. That way, if it comes back undelivered, they can deduce that the butler is not waiting for them at the manor. Holmes learns that Barrymore's family has served the Baskervilles for generations, and he asks if the butler came into any money from the old man's will. Turns out he and his wife received £500 each, and Sherlock's eyebrow went up. That is very interesting, he said. Without trying to nail down a hard number, my research indicates that amount would have been as much as a couple years' salary for each of them. So as a couple, they just came into 4 years' worth of money. Dr. Mortimer says he hopes that not everyone who received money from the will is going to be a suspect, because he himself had been left £1,000. Sherlock looked up at the ceiling as he processed this and asked who else was a beneficiary of the will. Mortimer claims there were many donations to charities and sums left to individuals, but none as large or larger than those mentioned, and that the sum of it, roughly £740,000, had been left to Sir Henry. A ballpark number equivalent today would be decently over £100 million, or in the vicinity of $150 million US. And even though Sir Charles was a wealthy landowner, this sum would have been shockingly high to a reader of this book when it came out. Upon learning this was the value of the estate, Holmes became more serious about learning who might want to get their grubby little hands on it. There are no other inheritors in line behind Henry, he asked. Well, the doctor thought, since the other brother, Henry's black sheep uncle, died childless, the next closest of kin was an elderly clergyman who Mortimer had met and claims lived a very saintly life. The conversation then turns to Sir Henry's departure from London and his arrival at his ancient family home. And it's decided, because Sherlock offers it up, that Watson will go with Henry since Mortimer will have to return to his own home and practice, and Sherlock is too tied up with some events here in London at the moment. Sherlock had volunteered Watson without his prior knowledge that this suggestion would be made, but he was flattered at how Holmes built him up in the eyes of the baronet as a charming companion and capable protector. Plus, Watson thought, quote, "The promise of adventure had always a fascination for me." That line immediately took me back to my favorite line from Treasure Island, quote, "The scheme had an air of adventure that inspired me." There's something about exploring the unknown that has a gravitational pull to many, and I always love when someone tries to put that magnetic appeal into words. Just before leaving the hotel, one of Sir Henry's boots was discovered, tossed into a corner of the room. He swears that it must have been placed there recently because he says he looked at everything when it had gone missing. It was the new boot he'd lost the previous day. On the cab ride back to Baker Street, Sherlock was silent. His mind was racing with calculations and simulations of theories. That evening, 2 wires came back to Sherlock. One was from Sir Henry saying, "Have just heard that Barrymore is at the Hall." And the other came from little Cartwright reporting on his errand. "Visited 23 hotels as directed, but sorry to report unable to trace cut sheets of times." Instead of being upset or disheartened, Sherlock grinned slyly as he told Watson, "There is nothing more stimulating than a case where everything goes against you." Shortly after that, their final big lead was addressed. The cab driver of 2704 showed up having been asked to visit Holmes. Sherlock offers the man some money for information about his fare earlier that day. The man says he doesn't know anything significant about the man himself, but that he'd been given a large sum to be his personal driver all day long. He talks about how he was instructed to follow two men, how they'd stayed parked on this very street for some time while they were in a building nearby. And Sherlock is quick to correct him that it was this very building. And then when they came out, they began to follow them again until suddenly the passenger became anxious and yelled at him to get to Waterloo Station as fast as possible. The driver says that the passenger had told him he was a detective and that was why they were following these men around all day. Did he say his name? Holmes asked. He did, just as he left the cab. Well, what was it, man? His name was Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Coming from Watson, never have I seen my friend more completely taken aback than by the cabman's reply. For an instant he sat in silent amazement, then he burst into a hearty laugh. The cabbie was paid his money and sent on his way. Sherlock was delighted at this turn. He kept grinning as he described how brilliant his opponent was to know about Henry's movements, as well as to have anticipated Sherlock would inquire with the cab driver. I tell you, Watson, this time we've got a foeman who is worthy of our steel. I've been checkmated in London. I can only wish you better luck in Devonshire. A couple days later, the three men set off, Dr. Mortimer, Sir Henry, and Watson. Sherlock had given very strict instructions about the type of reporting he expected to hear from Watson so he could stay aware of what was going on. He goes down the list of residents that are possible suspects, or neighbors, depending on how you look at it. There are the Barrymores. There was Dr. Mortimer and his wife, who Holmes feels is an entirely honest man. There was the naturalist, which if you've listened to enough episodes of the show, you might remember that natural philosophy was the term used for science before science was commonly used. So Stapleton, the naturalist, is likely some sort of biologist, herbologist, geologist, or maybe some combination of different natural sciences. Then there was Mr. Franklin, the old man who lived at Laughter Hall. No one else that had been mentioned seemed to be of note, so these are who Watson should focus his attention on. The detective urges Henry to not disregard the warning of his family legend regardless of if the supernatural is involved or not. Do not go out on the moor at night, he said. As they're about to climb onto the train, Sherlock remembers to ask the baronet if they ever found his other boot. No, Henry sighed, that one is gone forever. The ride was pleasant with the three companions. Learning more of Henry's upbringing in America, he expresses that he is eager to see the moor again, which he hasn't seen since he was a child. Mortimer says that he should look now then because they are just coming upon it. He looked out the carriage window and over the green squares of the fields and the low curve of a wood, there rose in the distance a gray, melancholy hill with a strange jagged summit, dim and vague in the distance, like some fantastic landscape in a dream. Baskerville sat for a long time, his eyes fixed upon it, and Watson read upon his eager face how much it meant to him. This first sight of that strange spot where the men of his blood had held sway so long and left their mark so deep. There he sat, with his tweed suit and his American accent, in the corner of a prosaic railway carriage, and yet as Watson looked at his dark and expressive face, he felt more than ever how true a descendant he was of that long line of high-blooded, fiery, and masterful men. When the train stopped, Watson was surprised to see several armed men in uniform. A coachman was waiting for them to take them to the hall, and as the journey continued, the landscape got more of a description, which is important because the moor is basically a character in this story. Quote, rolling pasture lands curved upward on either side of us, and old gabled houses peeped out from amid the thick green foliage, but behind the peaceful and sunlit countryside, there rose ever, dark against the evening sky, the long, gloomy curve of the moor, broken by the jagged and sinister hills. At one point on their journey, there was a checkpoint with more armed men in uniform who were stopping everyone for inspection. Mortimer asked the driver what was going on, and we learned that there has been an escaped convict from the Princetown prison. On the run for 3 days now, there had been no sight of him, but the law was cracking down on all forms of transportation to make sure he didn't get far. Who escaped? The doctor asked. Selden, sir, he said, the Notting Hill murderer. Watson blinked at the name. He'd remembered reading about this man in the paper. The ferocity and brutality of the case had stood out to him. The sheer violence of the murders had led to debates over the man's sanity and if he could be sentenced to death for his crimes. The wagon had just crested a hill that opened up to a wide view of the moor, and it was as if all three men stared out on their own in silence, contemplating how somewhere out there was a man with fiendish intent lurking, lying in wait for the first opportunity to escape, or maybe to kill again. As the evening grew later and the sky darker, there was a sigh of relief almost when, from the surrounding barrenness of the moor, the first sight of two high towers in the distance signaled that they were nearing Baskerville Hall. Henry was peering out the window of the carriage, eagerly taking in every little detail that he could spot. A few minutes later, they had reached the lodge gates, a maze of fantastic tracery in wrought iron with weather-bitten pillars on either side, blotched with lichens and surmounted by the boars' heads of the Baskervilles. The lodge was a ruin of black granite and bared ribs of rafters, but facing it was a new building, half-constructed, the first fruit of Sir Charles's South African gold. Once inside the gates, Henry remarks that the gloom of the place would be enough to make any man believe in tales of monsters, and that his first order of business will be to get electric lamps set up outside to illuminate the driveway. Just then, they heard a man's voice say, "Welcome, Sir Henry, to Baskerville Hall." They turned to see a tall man standing in the doorway. Next to him was a woman. These were the Barrymores. Mortimer had the driver take him straight home. His wife would be waiting for him. But Watson and the baronet entered the ancient halls of Sir Henry's new inheritance for the first time. They walked in silent reverence as they took in the lofty rafters made from blackened oak. The massive fireplace blazed with warmth, and the travelers held their hands close to it. There were large, stained glass windows, oak paneling on the interior walls, mounted stag heads from successful hunts of previous owners. The coat of arms hung on the wall. "It's just as I imagined it," Henry said with a smile. He comments that this is exactly what one thinks of when you imagine an old family home. To think this should be the same hall which for 500 years my people have lived in. Barrymore had just returned from taking the men's baggage to their rooms. He was a handsome man with a square beard and pale skin. Barrymore says dinner will be ready shortly and that there is hot water in their rooms for them to clean up with. And then very abruptly states that he and his wife are happy to stay with Sir Henry until he finds adequate help, but they would like to depart from service at Baskerville Hall at the earliest convenience. Henry is shocked. The Barrymore family had been linked to the Baskervilles for such a long time. A fine how-do-you-do this was shaping up to be. Barrymore said that serving Sir Charles had been simple enough for the two of them because the man had a very retired life, but someone as young and ambitious as Sir Henry would surely need a much larger staff on hand, and that despite the strong ties between the two families, the husband and his wife feel that they will never be able to be at peace at the hall again after what happened to the late squire. The new arrivals went up to their rooms. Watson was just down the hall from the quarters of Sir Henry, and after freshening up a bit, they came down to dinner. Torches lit the hall, but it appeared fairly gloomy with just the two men sitting in the quiet darkness eating. "My word, it isn't a very cheerful place, is it?" asked Henry. Watson couldn't help but agree. It was easy enough to see why the old man may have been on edge living here by himself. As he prepared for bed, Watson looked out through his window at the moor, partially illuminated by a half moon. It was a dreary sight. As Watson lay in bed, he tossed restlessly. What a strange circumstance he found himself in. Why did it feel so dark and dreary? Was it because of a curse? Or did the story of a curse just feel more plausible in a place like this? As he lay awake in the silence, slowly, a sound came to his ears. One that didn't help put him to sleep in the slightest. It was the sound of a woman crying. Okay, I think there are two things I need to address here for a large portion of my audience. For people from England or other parts of Europe, this is not that strange of an idea, but the American mind cannot comprehend the idea of a 500-year-old house. Our country is not even 250 years old. So imagine coming to inherit a house that is 2 times as old as our country is. It's just insane to think about. If the house is 500 years old, that means it was built within a few decades of Columbus discovering America. But in the old country, this would not be that far-fetched. Sure, it would be a somewhat decrepit house in need of renovations, but that would only add to the spooky vibe for readers. Secondly, let's talk about moors. We don't use this term to describe the geography of any part of America that I'm aware of, yet it is possibly the most used word in this book after the names of the characters. Even if you don't know how to describe a moor, you'd recognize one. It's essentially a vast, rolling terrain, often with very few trees, but covered in all sorts of vegetation and rocky outcroppings. Honestly, my mind goes to it being a similar vibe as a desert here in the western United States, but instead of being dry, it is a very damp climate, which is why instead of vast expanses of sand, it's covered in grass and plants. But it has a similar air of desolation or isolation that being in the desert would have. It's wild, untamable, with plenty of character, but so wide open that it feels daunting. So as you try to envision the environment the story takes place in, hopefully that description helps. The next morning, after not enough hours of sleep, the sun filled the hall enough that both men agree maybe they'd been too hasty to judge the place as dreary. But at the same time, Watson asks Henry if he'd heard the crying in the night as well. The squire nodded and said that when he thinks of it, in a half-asleep state, he had thought he'd heard a woman crying, but he just assumed it was part of a dream. Then they asked Barrymore, and although looking paler than usual, the butler said there are only 2 women in the house, the scullery maid, who sleeps across the house from the 2 men, and then there's Barrymore's own wife, and he swears it wasn't her. Watson quickly decided that that had been a lie, because when Mrs. Barrymore came in carrying food, her face betrayed her. Red eyes, swollen lids. This woman had been the night crier. But why? The weeping had been so disturbing. It just gave the mystery around Barrymore even more cause for caution. Being his first day as lord of the estate, Henry was going to be busy going through stacks of mail and bills that had accumulated since Charles's passing. So Watson decided to go for a walk along the moor. 4 miles into the journey, he came across the small village that served as the commercial center for the region. Grimpen was its name. The postmaster was also the village grocer, and Watson asked him about the telegram Holmes had sent with strict instructions to only deliver it to Barrymore himself. Watson is troubled to learn that a small boy had been sent to deliver it and that, in fact, it had been delivered to Mrs. Barrymore, despite the very clear instructions. In a small place like this where everyone knew each other, it appeared that the idea of giving the message to the man's wife was as good as giving it to him. Mrs. Barrymore had said that her husband was up in the loft at the time, so she would take the message. So now they were back to considering if the bearded man in London might be Sir Henry's own butler. Watson continued his walk beyond the village, and his mind weighed on him with the possibilities. He wished Sherlock's business in London would end quickly so he could join him. But his thoughts were interrupted at the sound of footsteps behind him. Running footsteps. But there was a voice calling him by name. Not a voice he knew, however. Soon, a stranger came into view, a slim, clean-shaven man dressed in a gray suit, wearing a straw hat. He carried a box over his shoulder for collecting plant specimens, and there was a butterfly net in his hands. The man begged forgiveness for the informality of his introduction, but says that here on the moor they are a casual bunch. "I am Stapleton of Merripit House," the man said. Watson said the net and box would have told him as much based on what he knew of the neighbors. Watson asked how the naturalist had known who he was, but Stapleton's explanation was that he had been at Mortimer's, and through the window they had seen Watson out on his walk. Stapleton rushed off to introduce himself. Stapleton had questions about Sir Henry. He asked if Watson knew the story of the dog, and how it amazed him how the peasants seemed so quick to believe such a wild tale. "I suppose Sir Charles must have truly seen something that night, and that his weak heart was not capable of dealing with the fright." "How did you know about his heart?" Watson asked. "My friend Mortimer told me," Stapleton said with a smile. He continued, "What does Sherlock Holmes think of this?" Watson was so stunned by the detailed knowledge this naturalist seemed to have of himself and Holmes, but apparently the neighbor recognized the look of disbelief on Watson's face, and he assures him that the tales of Sherlock, written by Watson himself, had reached them on the moor, so if Watson were here, he could only assume Sherlock had been made aware of the case. Watson supposes that's plausible, but is still stunned at the attentiveness of this butterfly hunter. Not eager to confirm anything, Watson insists he is just here as a friend of Sir Henry and that no investigation is going on. Stapleton just smiled and leaned in, saying quietly, "Excellent. You are right to be so secretive. I apologize for my nosiness." He then points off in one direction where a diversion in the moor path led to an unseen location. "A moderate walk down there will put us at Merripit House. Please say you'll come visit so I can introduce you to my sister." Watson wanted to return to Baskerville Hall, but he remembered the massive pile of letters and bills on Henry's desk, and he knew he still had plenty of time to kill, so he agreed. As they walked, Stapleton gushed over the moor, how vast it is, how many secrets it holds, how many rare specimens he finds on his ventures. "It does look like a great place for a horse ride," Watson said. "You'd think so," Stapleton replied, "but look over there. See those green spots scattered in the distance?" "Yes," Watson said. It appeared more fertile than the rest of the region. "Ha ha," laughed Stapleton. "That is the Grimpen Mire. One false step would be the death of a man or beast. I've seen more ponies get sucked into its pits. I am the only person here who can navigate it safely. I've gone to the heart of it and returned." Just then, he spotted another pony walking through part of the landscape, and all they could do was watch as it took one wrong step and let out a terrified whinny as it got sucked into the quicksand-like pits. The head writhed and twisted, but its desperate attempts to escape only made it be sucked down faster until its cries stopped and it was silent again. Now, it's important to distinguish the moor from the mire, since those words are very similar. The moor is the entire region. The mire is one part of the region, which I think is best described as a swamp that has so much peat and vegetation in it that the swamp becomes almost quicksand-like. Between the decaying peat and the soft mud at the bottom of the swamp pools, it sucks you down very similarly to how you'd imagine quicksand working. So the moor contains the Grimpen Mire within it. And by the way, all these are either real places or they are based on real places within Devonshire in the little nub of the southwest part of England. It is very much a moor like our story describes, and the Grimpen Mire is based on a real mire in the region known as the Fox Tor Mires, giving the story even more realism to its reader. But back to Watson, he's asking why a man would want to venture into such a dangerous territory like Stapleton was claiming to have done. His answer is that through the mire is a very rarely accessed part of the island that contains rare plant and butterfly species, so he is naturally drawn to it. Watson half joked that he will have to try his luck one day, but the expression on the naturalist's face was deadly serious, as he said he should put that idea out of his mind. The last thing Stapleton needed was the blood of the famous Dr. Watson on his hands. But before Watson could respond, there was a sound that sent a shudder through his spine. It was a long, low moan, sad and haunting. It seemed to fill the whole air, but it was so atmospheric that it was impossible to know what direction it had come from. It rose from the dull murmur to a roar and dropped back to a melancholic drone. Stapleton just smiled and said, "Strange place, the moor." "But what was that?" Watson demanded. "Well," Stapleton said, "if you believe the peasants, then what you've just heard is the Hound of the Baskervilles calling for its prey. I've heard it a couple times, but never as loud as that." Watson wasn't satisfied with that answer, and Stapleton then suggested that the bog itself makes odd sounds, mud settling, water rising, but Watson is defiant in saying that the sound came from a living creature. "Have you ever heard a bittern booming?" the naturalist asked. He then described the bittern as an almost extinct bird that makes a surprisingly deep sound, and you won't believe what it actually sounds like. Check this out. If you're listening and can't see the image I put up, just imagine that sound coming from a very average-sized looking bird. It's insane that it's capable of such a booming sound. Watson still wasn't completely satisfied with that possibility, but as they rounded a corner to a new view of the moor, Watson noticed a number of ancient stone rings in the ground. Stapleton informs him that they are the ancient homes of moor dwellers from prehistoric times. Some of them looked similar to igloos, but made of stone with no enclosed roof on top. Watson asks what time period this is from, and Stapleton said the Neolithic, putting them anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 years old. The good doctor was stunned at this revelation, yet another fascinating detail about this place. Before Watson could ask more details, Stapleton took off running, saying he'd just seen a butterfly he'd been trying to collect, and he took off, net raised above his head. Watson watched as the scientist awkwardly zigged and zagged in the distance, chasing the butterfly when he heard soft footsteps and looked up to see a beautiful woman that he assumed must be Miss Stapleton, since there were very few ladies on the moor. He had heard she was beautiful, but was still surprised at how elegant she seemed, and how great the contrast was between her and her brother. He had light hair, gray eyes, and neutral features, but she had dark eyes, strong, alluring features. When Watson turned around, she had been looking at her brother off in the distance, but now she was hurrying towards Watson, and before he could even say hello, she hissed out a warning, "Go back. Go straight back to London instantly." Watson blinked. He was too stunned to say anything. When he finally mustered a question asking why should he go back, she just said she couldn't explain, but that he should just do as she says and never come back to the moor. When he protests that he just got here, she stamps at him desperately. "Can you not tell when a warning is for your own good? Go back to London. Get away from this place at all costs," she said. Then, in lower tones, "Hush, my brother is coming. Don't say a word of what I've told you." When Stapleton got back, he saw his sister there and greeted her. "Hello, Beryl," he said. She returned his greeting, commenting how he looked very hot and sweaty. "I was chasing a cyclopides," he said. "Very rare to find this late in the year." "I see you've introduced yourselves," he asked. Beryl spoke first, saying she was just telling Sir Henry how it was strange for the orchids to still be beautiful at this time of year. Jack, which is Stapleton's first name, laughed and corrected his sister, saying this was not Sir Henry. Watson then introduced himself, and he saw a look of great embarrassment flush on her face. They walked back together to Merripit House, which was simple and humble compared to Baskerville Hall, but it was still a spacious house for the siblings and their servants. But Watson was surprised that a highly educated man and his beautiful sister would choose to reside in such an isolated place. Stapleton tells a story of how he had been a schoolmaster further north until an epidemic broke out, and several of the children died. The school had to shut down as a result, and out of a job, he decided to pursue his true passion, botany and zoology, and that lucky for him, his sister is as devoted to nature as he is. He jokes that Watson must find their life very dull. The good doctor says maybe he feels that way more for Miss Beryl than for Stapleton, who clearly loves it out here. But the sister forced a smile and said she is very dull herself and finds it quite enough living here. They have their books and they make friends with the neighbors. "By the way," Jack asked, "would it be too imposing on Sir Henry if I stopped by this afternoon to introduce myself?" "Not at all," Watson said. "I'm sure he'd be delighted." Stapleton offered to show Watson his insect collection, but the doctor said he should be getting back. He took the same path back from Merripit House, but was shocked when Miss Beryl was waiting for him up ahead. There must have been some shortcut he was not aware of. "I had to cut you off," she said. "I'm very sorry about what I said earlier. Please, forget everything I said." "How could I forget them?" Watson asked. "I am Sir Henry's friend. If you meant them for him, I am even more curious to what you meant." "Just a woman's whim," she said unconvincingly. "I remember the look in your eyes as you spoke, Miss Beryl. Please, be honest with me." Her face paused, as if contemplating something briefly, but in the end she just doubled down on her claim that it was a silly thing said in a moment of mental lapse. She claimed she was just so troubled by the death of Sir Charles that she was concerned for anyone who was planning on living there. You know, because of the Hound. "Why should he wish to live in a place of danger like this?" she asked. "Because it is the place of danger," Watson said. "That is Sir Henry's nature." He tries to get more info out of her, but she says nothing more than to beg him not to say any of this to her brother. He is so eager for the Hall to finally have an inhabitant again. He thinks it does a lot of good for the entire region, and he would be upset if he heard Beryl was trying to get rid of their new baronet. She then says she must get back and leaves Watson standing on the path, alone and more confused than ever. At this point, for a few chapters, the book switches format. Instead of being a narration from the moments when things are happening, we have a few chapters where we're getting written reports from Watson to Holmes about what has happened in and around the moor. Do you remember what that's called? An epistolary. And yep, this was a format we discussed last year during spooky season when we read Frankenstein and Dracula, which are both entirely epistolary in nature. And I know other horror classics like Call of Cthulhu are also told in this format. And it got me thinking about why is this format such a natural choice for horror and thriller stories? I did a little digging, I did a little LLMing, and there are several possible reasons. I'll share some briefly. One, it makes us feel less in the know. When we have a narrator, omniscient or not, it feels like we're getting a pretty good account of the events. Whereas letters or newspaper articles are more brief, they're often more singular in nature, leaving us feeling like we may not know everything that's going on. It also makes us feel more isolated because we're no longer with the narrator. When we're listening to Watson describe things as the narrator, it's almost as if we're in the room with him as he's telling the story. But when we're just reading letters he wrote, we feel even more removed from him. And horror, suspense, it thrives on making you feel isolated and alone. But it also makes us feel more like a detective. Instead of just being hand-fed all the info, fragmented knowledge from epistolaries leaves us to connect more of the dots on our own, which can be fun. And finally, it's just a great way to summarize a lot of events because it feels natural for a character to not go into as great of a detail when writing a letter. So you can get through more in less time, which exactly what this chapter is about. I'm going to go through the events from this first account of Watson's in bulleted fashion. First off, it has been presumed that Selden, the escaped convict, is no longer in the area. No sightings and no reports of stolen goods or killed animals, so it's assumed he has successfully gotten away. People are feeling a little more at ease. Next, the Stapletons have become quick friends with Sir Henry. But not only that, Sir Henry seems to have taken an interest in Miss Beryl, and she sure seems to return that interest. Watson is fascinated with the difference between the siblings. She has an exotic and almost tropical air about her. Jack, on the other hand, seems cool and unemotional, although, and this is one of my favorite lines from the book, yet he also gives the idea of hidden fires. I would like to be mysterious enough one day that people find themselves describing me as cool and collected, but giving the sense of hidden fires. One day, Jack took Henry and Watson to the site of the supposed legend where the demon Hound killed Sir Hugo all those years ago. Watson describes the site as gloomy enough to correspond with the scene of the tragedy. Henry asks Stapleton if he really believed the Hound might be real, and Stapleton tried to act skeptic about it, but it felt evident he did truly consider it at least a possibility. A day or two after that, Dr. Mortimer had come to the hall for lunch. The Stapletons were there as well, and the doctor showed all of them the yew alley and described where and how Sir Charles had been found there dead. Even in the daylight, the idea of being trapped in this alley with a spectral hound made everyone feel uneasy. We also meet Mr. Franklin, the other neighbor, who is an eccentric old man who animatedly talks about nothing but the law. And at any given time, he is engaged in several lawsuits against cities or individuals that he finds in violation of said laws. He has some level of wealth, but most of it was tied up in his different lawsuits. But he didn't seem to care. He was a man obsessed with seeing the law be carried out to its most exact point. But when he's not busy plotting his next lawsuit, he is a nice enough person and good-natured. Watson doesn't know how much he's worth mentioning, except that Holmes had asked for reports on all the neighbors. And that leaves us with the Barrymores. They are such an odd pair in Watson's appraisal. Watson had told Sir Henry about how the telegram test had failed since it was delivered to the wife, and Sir Henry, in his typical blunt manner, went straight to the butler and asked him about if he had received the telegram himself. And Barrymore said no, his wife had taken it because he was in the box room. And I don't often like to rob you of being able to feel like you're putting the clues together yourself, but in case you can't remember, that is not the same room that she had told the postmaster's boy her husband had been in. We'll see if that matters later down the road. Mrs. Barrymore, on the other hand, seemed to be constantly choking down her emotions. Watson felt like she was always on the verge of tears, something gnawing at her heart. And the final account in this chapter is of Watson expressing how, for the last 2 nights, he has heard footsteps creep past his door. On the second night, he followed the steps to discover Barrymore crouching at a window in a room at the end of the hall, holding a candle up to the window. He seemed to be peering intently in the direction of the moor. He waited there until the butler made a deep groaning sound and then impatiently snuffed out the light. Watson snuck back to his room. Luckily, it had become clear to them during this time that Barrymore was partially deaf, so Watson wasn't worried about being heard himself. Watson signs off the letter saying, "I do not trouble you with my theories, for you ask me to furnish you only with facts." But he's talked to Sir Henry, and they have a plan for what to do if the dark nighttime creepings of Barrymore carry on for a 3rd night in a row. The second of our epistolary chapters has less events to share in terms of number, but they are far juicier, so we're going to take our time with these. This letter is dated 2 days after the first one, and the first incident is when Henry tells Watson he's going out. So naturally, Watson grabs his hat. His instructions were to go with Henry wherever he went. But Henry hesitated when he saw Watson go to join him. "My dear fellow," he said, "Holmes, with all his wisdom, did not foresee some things which have happened since I've been on the moor. You understand me? I'm sure you are the last man in the world who would wish to be a spoilsport. I must go alone." Watson was stunned. What should he do? He knew his orders, but he didn't want to make his friend, who was clearly off on some secret rendezvous, upset. His uncertainty lasted long enough for Henry to leave, but within a couple minutes, Watson knew he could not live with himself if anything happened to the squire because Watson had left him alone. So he followed after him into the moor. Watson climbed a hill where he could see from a distance and finally caught sight of his friend, who, as he had suspected, was meeting up with Miss Stapleton. He felt guilty for spying, but at least at this distance he could fulfill his promise to Holmes without completely robbing the two star-crossed lovers of their privacy. He was far enough away to not hear anything, but close enough that he could see what was going on. He watched, almost whimsically happy that young love seemed to be blooming, when out of the corner of his vision he saw something. In the distance, he saw a dash of color moving fast. When he looked more closely, it was Jack Stapleton moving down the slope like a madman, butterfly net in tow. He was making enough racket that Sir Henry instinctively stepped in front of Miss Barrow to protect her before he saw that it was her brother coming down towards them. Miss Stapleton appeared to be hiding her face from her brother. Watson could see Stapleton acting very animated and possibly yelling at Sir Henry before storming off, only to pause and motion for Miss Barrow to follow him. Sir Henry was left alone, confused and speechless at what had just happened. Watson worked his way down to him and confessed to his spying, but despite feeling slightly betrayed, Sir Henry was glad that someone else had witnessed what had just happened. "Did Jack ever strike you as being crazy?" he asked. "It never had until now," Watson assured him. "Well, either he or I ought to be in a straitjacket," Henry said. "You've lived with me for some weeks now, Watson. Is there anything about me that would make me not a good candidate to be a husband to Beryl?" Watson said there was nothing at all. "Well, Stapleton sure seems to take issue with me courting his sister," he said. He admitted to Watson that even his rendezvous did not go as expected. Beryl had seemed glad enough to accept the meetup, but once they were together, she just kept warning him about the danger he was in. Watson writes that later the same day, Stapleton showed up penitent, asking forgiveness for his behavior, saying that his sister is the only person in his life, so when he thought of losing her, he lost his head. He says he has no objection to Sir Henry as a suitor, but just asks that they don't rush things so that he has time to adjust to it. He asked that they give it 3 months before he proposed to her. Just get to know her during that time. Watson was relieved to have one of the many mysteries cleared up. That night, however, it was time to catch Barrymore in the act of his candle signaling again. Watson stayed up with Henry in his room, waiting for the footsteps. It was almost 2 a.m. when they finally heard the creeping steps go down the hall. They followed Barrymore and found him in the same position, crouched at the window of the room at the end of the hall, holding a candle up, staring out into the moor. Watson writes that we had arranged no plan of campaign, but the baronet is a man to whom the most direct way is always the most natural. Barrymore started when Henry called his name. "What are you doing here, Barrymore?" the squire demanded. "Nothing, sir," Barrymore squeaked. It was obvious he was scrambling for some explanation. "I go around every night to check the windows are fastened." "On the second floor?" Henry pressed. "Yes, sir. Your uncle wished it so." "We will have the truth out of you," Henry ordered. "What were you doing at the window?" "Don't ask me, sir." Barrymore's pitiful face showed genuine distress. Watson suggested he must have been using the candle to signal to someone. The doctor walked up, took the candle, and held it to the window as Barrymore had done. Within a few seconds, the faint glow of a light out on the moor reflected back at him. Barrymore tried to convince them it was nothing, but Henry told Watson to try again. They got the same result. "What is this conspiracy you are partaking in?" Henry said grimly, losing his patience with the sneaky butler. Barrymore had finally gathered himself enough to reply defiantly. "It is my business and not yours. I will not tell." "Then you'll leave my employment immediately," Henry stated. "Very good, sir. If I must, I must." And you'll go in disgrace. Your family has lived with mine for 100 years, and here you are plotting against me." "No, no, sir, not against you," came a softer voice. It was Mrs. Barrymore. Her husband immediately could tell she was about to reveal the secret they had been keeping all this time, and he looked at her sternly as if advising her against it. "My poor brother is starving on the moor, sir," she said. "The light is our signal to him that food is ready, and his light is a signal for where to bring it." "So your brother is," Henry trailed off, "the escaped convict Selden, sir." Now that this knowledge is out in the open, Barrymore backed up his wife, saying that that is what they'd been up to all this time. Mrs. Barrymore expresses her distress that he was such a loving boy, and it breaks her heart to see the monster he's become, but they had been doing what they could to keep him safe since he'd escaped. She said if any punishment needed to be given, it should fall on her. Henry said he could understand the instinct of a sister to care for her brother and for a husband to back up his wife, and he told them to go to bed and they'd talk more in the morning. As soon as they were gone, Henry turned to Watson and began to discuss a plan of action. Just because they couldn't expect the Barrymores to turn him in didn't mean that the squire was going to let a convicted murderer wander free. Watson was of the same mind, and they set off immediately to find the light out on the moor. They grabbed Watson's revolver, put on their boots, and set off into the night. It was cold, and the air was heavy with the damp smell of decay. As they moved through the dark mire, Sir Henry joked in a whisper about what Holmes would say if he saw him out on the moor during the darkness when the power of evil is exalted. But almost as if in answer to his joke, the quiet night was broken by a cry that Watson recognized immediately, as the lonely, haunting yelp he'd heard on the Grimpen Mire the day he'd met Stapleton faded into a sad moan before rising again into the piercing cry that made you wish you'd been born without ears. What was that, Watson?" "I don't know," he replied. "I've heard it before, but I don't know what it is." "It's the Hound," Henry said, a tremor in his voice. Watson felt cold on the inside. The baronet moaned as if ill. The howling finally died off, and Sir Henry slowly recovered from his fit of fear. "Is it possible I am really in danger from so dark a cause?" he asked Watson in a controlled and still tense voice. Watson tried to reassure him that it couldn't be the supernatural. Henry was still struggling to shake it off. "And yet it was one thing to laugh about in London, and it is another to stand out here in the darkness of the moor to hear such a cry as that," he said. "I don't think I am a coward, Watson, but that sound seemed to freeze my very blood." He held his hand out for Watson to feel. It was cold as a block of ice. "I don't think I'll ever be able to get that cry out of my head," he said. Watson asked him if he wanted to turn back, but Henry seemed to take courage in the idea that he could reclaim his dignity by continuing on to find the criminal. They pressed forward, but found themselves surprised how far away the light actually was. Quote, "There is nothing so deceptive as the distance of a light upon a pitch-dark night." But as the night crept closer to dawn, they finally spotted the light again. It turned out to be a large candle wedged between rocks to protect it from the wind, but more importantly, to make sure that the light was only noticeable from the direction of Baskerville Hall. They only had to wait for a minute before they saw him. Quote, "Over the rocks in the crevice of which the candle burned, there was thrust out an evil yellow face, a terrible animal face, all seamed and scored with vile passions, foul with mire, with a bristled beard, and hung with matted hair. It might well have belonged to one of those old savages who dwelt in the burrows on the hillsides. The light beneath him was reflected in his small, cunning eyes, which peered fiercely to right and left through the darkness, like a crafty and savage animal who has heard the steps of the hunters." Watson made a move, but Selden cursed at him and threw a rock that missed his head by only a foot. The convict took off into the night. They tried to follow, but they were far clumsier than he was in the rough terrain with little moonlight. They crested the hill he had gone over, only to see that he was increasing the gap between them. They continued to follow him until he was just a tiny speck in the moonlight, and then he was gone. Sir Henry and Watson stopped, panting for air after they lost sight of Selden, but then, Watson remarks, the most unexpected and strange thing happened. As they turned to head back to Baskerville Hall, on the horizon where the moon was setting, on top of the low ridge of rocky hills, there was a figure of a man. The shadow of his outline was all but visible, but it stirred a sense of fear and mystery in Watson's heart. In his letter, remember, this is an account from Watson's Sherlock, The man was tall, thin, and stood there with his arms folded as if he were brooding over the vastness of the moor. He might have been the very spirit of that terrible place, he wrote. But it was not the convict. This was nowhere near the direction Selden had taken off. Watson yelled out and tried to point the figure out to Sir Henry, but before the squire could get a look, the figure was gone. Watson desired to pursue the mystery man, but Henry's nerves were still shot from the hound's cry, and it was almost dawn. They both needed rest. Watson finishes his letter to his friend and asks him to try to come out to Baskerville Hall as soon as possible. They need him. The next chapter is an extract from the diary of Watson, and by the way, I feel like it's worth noting, one of the things that makes the Hound of the Baskervilles unique is that of all the Sherlock Holmes detective stories, only a few have Watson as more than the sidekick. The fact that he is our main character, at least for now, is very rare. Especially this story because it's the only novel that does this. Almost all of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and if you recall I said there are 60 total and only 4 of them are novel length, and this is the only one of the 4 where Watson takes center stage for a time. But the next morning, after he'd gotten a few hours of sleep, his mind was on edge. Who had that man been? What was the sound? Was it a hellish hound? No. Put that out of your mind, Watson, he thought. You are descending to the levels of peasants to entertain such a notion. But he couldn't deny what he'd heard or seen, unless they were imaginations, or at least exaggerations, of an exhausted mind. But he tried to put those things out of his mind as he went about his day. The sound of the hound he was able to forget about, but the man, he couldn't. Who could it have been? It was too tall to be Stapleton, too skinny to be Mr. Frankland. The size didn't match up with Mortimer or Barrymore either. There seemed to be someone else on the moor, someone who was watching the movements of the baronet. He recounts how the Barrymores were very distressed when they realized that the 2 men had hunted her brother that night. They begged them to leave him be and claimed that within a few days he'd be on a boat out of the country and he wouldn't be a threat to anyone here any longer. Sir Henry was against it initially. He didn't like the idea of being an accessory to a violent criminal getting away. But the Barrymores pleaded so dearly that he ended up asking Watson for his take. The doctor just shrugged and said if he was out of the country, it would remove a burden from the taxpayers. So when Sir Henry agrees to keep his mouth shut, the Barrymores reveal something that they hadn't shared with anyone that might be a clue to his uncle's demise. After he had died, Mrs. Barrymore was cleaning the fireplace in his office one day when she noticed a fragment of a letter that had been tossed in, but the flames hadn't completely burned it. The remaining fragment read, "Please, please, as you are a gentleman, burn this letter and be at the gate by 10 o'clock. The letter was signed L.L. It was a woman's handwriting. They told Sir Henry they'd kept it a secret once they discovered it because they didn't know if it might be used to damage Sir Charles's reputation, and they would never assist in doing that to their beloved employer. Sir Henry turned to Watson with a heavy sigh and asked him what he thinks of this new light. Quote, "It seems to leave the darkness rather blacker than before," the doctor shrugged. The next day, Watson had met up with Dr. Mortimer and asked him if he knew any women with the initials L.L. At first, Mortimer said no, but then he recalled one Laura Lyons, whom he'd forgotten initially because Lyons was her married name, and Mortimer knew her when she was single. Watson asked why that was. "Well, because she is Franklin's daughter." Remember, Franklin is the old man who liked to sue everybody. She'd married an artist named Lyons, who her father disapproved of. The man turned out to be a scoundrel, and he left her. Her father wouldn't take her back because of his disapproval, and she'd settled in a town not far from the moor and worked in order to survive. So Watson's plans for the following day were now set. He would travel to Coombe Tracy, a neighboring town, to call upon Laura Lyons. He notes that he feels he's becoming rather clever like Holmes because when Mortimer began to question why Watson wanted to know so much about Laura Lyons, he just asked the doctor what type of skull Mr. Frankland had, and that was enough to change the topic immediately. But back at Baskerville Hall, the Barrymores say they think Selden has left because they haven't seen sign of him since that night. But it comes up that they are aware of another man on the moor as well. Watson's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth when they said it. Selden had told them about him. He said they hadn't interacted, but that the 2 men in the wilderness were aware of each other. The only details Selden knew about the man, or at least that he'd passed on to Barrymore, were that he had a camp in one of the stone huts of the Neolithic peoples, and that he survived because he had a boy who regularly made deliveries with food. That night, there was an intense storm that shook the windows of Baskerville Hall. It made Watson ponder on the man who was out there in an uncovered hut of the ancient people. What kind of passion or hatred could lead a man to live in such desperate circumstances? Who could he be, and what could he be up to? By the way, as so often happens in great stories like this, Arthur Conan Doyle took some inspiration for this scenario from a very real myth, if it's correct to label a myth as real. In the Dartmoor region, there is a legend about Richard Cable, a 17th century squire who was known to act immorally, and rumor had made a pact with the devil. When Cable died in 1677, stories of black hounds haunting his tomb began to pop up. That grew into a story of his ghost wandering around Dartmoor, leading a pack of phantom dogs. And there were reports of hounds with fire in their eyes, terrorizing locals. Feels like a prime myth for someone to turn into a best-selling novel, right? We now pick back up with Watson returning to his full narrator duties instead of us reading his written recollections. He told Sir Henry about his discovery of Laura Lyons, and the baronet was at first eager to come with him until he decided his presence might make things harder for Watson to discover anything useful. Because if some sort of squire showed up at your house one day, you'd probably act differently. So when Watson arrived at her rooms in Coombe Tracey, he found her sitting at a typewriter working. She was skeptical of a stranger showing up and asked him why he had come. Watson said the first impression of Mrs. Lyons was admiration. Her hazel hair and freckled face made you want to be around her. But then the second impression was that of coarseness. There was something hard in her expression and the look in her eyes. She asked again why he had come. "I have the pleasure," he said, "of knowing your father." It was a clumsy introduction, and the lady made him feel it. Her strained relationship with her father made her not too happy to meet someone who claimed his friendship. "If it were not for the late Charles Baskerville and some other kind hearts, I might have starved for all my father cared," she said coldly. "The late Sir Baskerville is actually why I came to see you," Watson said. She suddenly looked nervous. Her fingers stroked the keys of her typewriter anxiously. "Did you write him any letters?" Watson asked. Her eyes shot up to meet Watson's in anger. "What is the point of these questions?" she demanded. "I am asking these questions to try and avoid a public scandal, Mrs. Lyons. It would be better for you to answer them to me than to the police." She sat silently, debating if she could trust Watson. Finally, she said she wrote him once or twice to acknowledge his kindnesses towards her. She explained that Mr. Stapleton, who she knew, had informed the squire of her needs, and that it was through Stapleton's kindness in looking out for her that Sir Charles ended up sending her enough money to survive on. "But did you ever write him asking to meet you?" Watson pressed. Her face flushed. "Certainly not," she exclaimed. "Not on the very day that he died?" The color now drained from her face. Her mouth twitched. "I could even quote you a passage," Watson said, knowing that he was close to a confession. Please, as you are a gentleman, burn this letter and be at the gate by 10 o'clock. She looked down at the ground and sputtered, "Is there no such thing as a gentleman anymore?" Watson informed her that the letter had been burned, but only that fragment had survived, including the initials LL. Finally, the dam of resistance broke, and she began to tell all. "Yes, I wrote it. Why should I deny it? I have no reason to be ashamed. I thought if I could meet with him, he might be able to help me." "But why so late an hour?" Watson asked. "I had only learned that very day he intended to travel, and I needed to meet with him before he left." "But why not call upon the house? Why a rendezvous in the garden?" "Do you think it proper for a married woman to go to a bachelor's house alone at that hour?" Watson tilted his head in acknowledgement. "Well, what happened?" he asked. "I never went." Watson thought she was putting up barriers again and sternly called out, "Mrs. Lyons?" But she held to that story, claiming that something intervened with her going, something private that she could not tell. "So you want me to believe that you made an appointment to meet with Sir Charles at the time and place of his death, but you didn't actually keep it?" "That's the truth," she proclaimed. Watson told her she was being too secretive for a woman who didn't want to be pulled into a murder investigation. She bit her lip as she weighed the risks of silence versus the truth, before finally explaining further that her life had been a living hell since her estranged husband still found ways to persecute her. and that she had recently learned of the possibility of divorce if she could pay certain expenses. Keep in mind, at this point in time, divorce initiated by women was a much harder thing. And so she had hoped Sir Charles might cover those necessary costs to give her her freedom back. "So why did you not meet him?" "Because I was given what I needed by another source." "And why did you not write to tell him?" "I would have done that had I not read about his death in the papers the next morning." Watson left her apartment more confused than ever. It had been an answer to one question that only spurred on several new questions. He reckoned her story seemed likely because it would be all too easy to prove if she'd used the local cab service to travel many miles to Baskerville Hall late on the night of the murder. But now that he was on his way back to the moor, his attention returned to his other lead, the man of mystery living among the stone huts of the ancient people, which, again, just an interesting aside, this region is actually known for its remains from Bronze Age inhabitants. The Dartmoor National Park has many stone circles, hut remnants, and other constructions that remind us of our ancestors. As Watson walked past Mr. Franklin's house, the old man spotted him and invited him in. It was during that conversation that Watson got a break in the form of a clue, as Franklin talked about seeing a child walking around on a regular basis carrying bundles with him off into the moor. Watson remembered Barrymore saying that the man was being supplied by an unknown child, and he gets Franklin to tell him what direction the boy had gone off in by pointing a finger, and with that, Watson was off. He rushed into the hillside, following the direction he'd been shown, and the moor soon enveloped him. The sun was starting to descend, and Watson was in the thick of it. It was a barren and lonely scene, and Watson's heart was beating fast with the anticipation of finding the man upon the moor. He eventually found a cluster of huts, but one caught his eye. It was one with enough of a remaining roof to offer the most protection from the elements, so he stalked it, slowly looping around towards the entrance, listening intently for any sound. His nerves tingled as he closed in on the entrance, tossing the cigarette he'd been smoking to settle his nerves. With a few bounding steps and his gun drawn, he dashed to the entryway to find it empty. But not uninhabited. There were signs that someone was actively living here. Blankets rolled up to one side, ashes of very recent fires, some cooking and dining utensils. There was a flat stone that served as a kind of table, and on it was a fresh bundle that must have been delivered by the boy recently. And under the bundle was a paper. Scrawled in rough handwriting, it said, "Dr. Watson has gone to Coombe Tracy." Watson was dumbfounded. He had never considered the man he was hunting might be hunting him. He was so focused on protecting Sir Henry, he'd never worried about if his own presence was an issue for anyone out here. How much did this man know? How closely had he been tailed? But Watson was a military man who did not let fear take hold of him for too long. As the sky grew darker, he huddled in the hut, hand on his gun, waiting for his confrontation with the dark man of devious intentions. At last, the sound of boots clinking on stones began to approach. Watson's finger slid down to the trigger, ready for action. He huddled in the darkest corner of the hut, trying to conceal himself. But as the steps drew closer to the entryway, they stopped. After a while, a few short steps put the man close enough to the entryway that the final rays of light cast a mild shadow over the doorway. "It is a lovely evening, my dear Watson," said a very familiar voice. "I really think it will be more comfortable outside than in." Stepping outside the story again real quick, did you know that this story was a resurrection of the character in a sense? The very first appearance of Sherlock Holmes showed up in 1887, but by 1893, Doyle was sick of writing the character, and he wanted his reputation to be for historical fiction novels that he'd been writing as well, and felt that the character of Holmes was taking him away from more important things. At that point, he'd written 2 novels and 26 short story mysteries with the detective from Baker Street. But with the final short story, called The Final Problem, he introduced Professor Moriarty. And without getting into the details, for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, he was killed off, and I use heavy air quotes when I say that, in the same way that he was in the second of the Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes movies starring Robert Downey Jr. This move outraged fans. The papers vilified him. This would be like if Pierce Brown or Sarah J. Maas decided to stop writing their ultra-famous series because they wanted to write self-help books. He received heaps of angry letters and had articles written about his terrible mistake and selfish choice. Thousands of people canceled their Strand magazine subscriptions, which is where the stories were initially published. And then, almost 10 years later, he finally agreed to bring him back. At first, he didn't want to commit to resurrecting the character, so this book technically just takes place earlier in the timeline and was supposed to mix in with the other stories he'd already written. But due to financial incentives and maybe enjoying the spotlight of writing things people were excited about again, a year after this book came out, so we're now talking 1903, he wrote a new short story called The Adventures of the Empty House, where he did actually explain that Sherlock had faked his death. And over the next 20 plus years, he released another 30 plus stories using the character. And it's not an uncommon thing for people to have creative desires that are deeper or more artistic than the ones that have given them acclaim. Whether it's a blockbuster movie star wanting to make Oscar bait movies or a content creator who wants to stop making sketches so they can focus on film acting, it's a familiar story for someone famous to feel trapped by the very thing that gave them public recognition in the first place. But luckily for us, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle didn't resist for too long. Watson sat there, dumbstruck, panting for several seconds before he could muster a single word. "Holmes?" he asked. "When you come out, please be careful where you point your revolver," his old friend requested. Watson stooped out of the hut entryway to see the amused gray eyes looking far too pleased with themselves, staring back at him. Holmes looked a little haggard from living on the moor, but he was clean. We will later learn that Cartwright, the same boy who ran around the hotels in London, had been brought out to be Holmes's delivery boy, and he brought not only food but clean clothes, so Sherlock didn't feel gross. Sherlock's face was much more tan than it usually was, and he looked a little wind-beaten, but he seemed healthy. Watson grabbed his hand and said he had never been more glad to see anyone in his life. He then asks Holmes how he had known it was him inside the hut, and Sherlock says that it was the cigarette butt outside, with the branding of their neighborhood tobacconist that gave it away. Holmes, in turn, was eager to learn what had led Watson to discover him. He correctly guessed that he had been first discovered when he'd clumsily let the moon fall behind him on the ridge that night. Holmes walked into the hut, saw the bundle and the note from Cartwright, and said, "Ah, you've been to Coombe Tracey, to see Mrs. Laura Lyons, I presume?" He congratulates Watson on having figured out that little connection, and it's only now that the excitement that Holmes is there has worn off, and Watson became annoyed, maybe even a little combative. "Have you been working the case from here? Did you lie to me when you said you had to stay in London? Why did you use me?" Watson expresses his feelings that he deserves better than to be just a puppet in Sherlock's games. Sherlock said he knew early on that he would have to come to the moor in secret. Their opponent was too sharp to get caught if he knew the great Sherlock Holmes was in the neighborhood. "But why keep me in the dark?" Watson demanded. "There would be no benefit to you knowing I was here, and it might lead to my discovery. You'd want to tell me something or get my opinions on your discoveries. This way, I got all the knowledge you collected that I would have collected myself if I'd come as Henry's visitor, but I've also achieved a large amount of clandestine information that I could only discover if no one suspected me." He assured Watson that the reports that had been sent to London had been forwarded to him, and they had been the most important things in leading him to his discoveries. He is very proud of how keen Watson has been observing things of this nature. Then he asks for the details of Watson's visit to Mrs. Lyons, saying that he'd known Lyons was some form of connection and that if Watson hadn't gone to see her that day, he would have probably gone himself the next. When Watson told him about the visit, Sherlock nodded, saying that this was most interesting and it filled in a crucial gap of knowledge he'd been puzzling over. "You know, of course, that she has a close, intimate connection to the man Stapleton?" he asked. Watson said he was not aware, and Sherlock said he had plenty of evidence to prove that they meet often, write often, and have an understanding between them. "If I could only use this to detach his wife," Holmes said thoughtfully. "His wife?" Watson gasped. Sherlock just turned his head and smiled at his friend. "Yes, I'm now giving you some information in return. The lady who passes as his sister is in fact his wife." Watson's head raced with all the interactions between Henry and Beryl and the strange ways Jack had reacted to seeing them get close. It kind of made sense. "But why the secrecy?" he asked. Sherlock tells him it's because that he foresaw having a wife would not be as useful to him in his plan as having a beautiful single lady that he could employ in tempting rich men. What he hadn't accounted for was the fact that he couldn't contain his own jealousy when it actually worked. Watson's mind turned to everything he'd known about the butterfly chaser. Quote, "In that impassive, colorless man with his straw hat and his butterfly net, I seemed to see something terrible, a creature of infinite patience and craft, with a smiling face and a murderous heart." "So he was our man in London?" Watson asked. "So I read the riddle," Sherlock replied. "But that would mean the warning letter was from her?" "Exactly." The shadows that had plagued Watson for weeks began to take shape, but seeing their true form was somehow more unsettling. "How can you be sure?" he asked. Holmes said it was because in the great lie that Stapleton had told Watson about his backstory, he'd included a bit of truth, as most good liars do, when he said that he'd been a schoolmaster in the north of England. Records are kept of that sort of thing, so it was easy to find a school in the north of England that had been shut down due to an epidemic, including the name of the schoolmaster, who had disappeared with his wife. The name on the record was not Stapleton, however, but other facts, like stories of how the missing man was a devoted entomologist, which is the name for a bug scientist, gave him the confirmation that he needed, that this was the same person. He reveals that Laura Lyons believes she will become engaged to Stapleton once her divorce is finalized, and that affection is how he has used her to his advantages. Then Sherlock tells his friend it's getting late and the doctor should get back to his charge, Sir Henry. Watson stood up to leave, but asked the real burning question. "What is the meaning of it all, Holmes? What is Stapleton after?" Sherlock's voice dropped as he delivered the answer dramatically. "It is murder, Watson. Refined, cold-blooded murder. His nets are closing around Stapleton, even as Stapleton's are closing around Sir Henry, which is why he wishes Watson would hurry back to Baskerville Hall so the squire is not left alone for a..." He stopped suddenly as a howl cut into the night. They'd both heard the sound before. It was just as horrifying as it had been on the previous occasions. But then there was a new sound, a scream. This was not a monstrous scream. It was a very human one, a terrible and prolonged yell of horror and pain. The two men sprang from the hut and ran through the twilight in the direction of the sound. The cry would die off for a second, only to return as if the tormented were being attacked again and again. As they drew closer to the screams, they cut off suddenly as they heard a sickening thud, and it was silent. Holmes stamped his feet and put his hand to his forehead. "He has beaten us, Watson. We're too late. This is what I get for holding my hand too close to my chest. And you, Watson, see what happens when you leave your charge unsupervised?" They kept running until they came to a collection of boulders that dropped down over a precipice. As they looked down over the edge, even in the mostly dark evening, they could make out the limp shape of a man on the rocks below them. He was face down, and his neck was bent at such an angle it was clear he was no longer alive. The rising moon cast just enough light to illustrate how horrible the scene was, and the first thing they noticed was the dark pool that was growing from under the head. Watson was the first to recognize the clothes. It was the ruddy tweed suit they'd first seen Sir Henry in back in London. Holmes groaned, and the two men both blamed themselves for having let this happen. "I have thrown away the life of my client," Sherlock cried out. "But how could I have known he would risk his life upon the moor after my warnings?" Watson said the worst thing was having been close enough to hear the horrible screams, but not close enough to save him. They agreed to one thing in that moment. Stapleton will pay for this. Murdering both uncle and nephew, he will be brought to justice. As they stood there, they noticed a single light of a lantern bouncing towards them from the direction of Merripit House. It was surely the murderer himself, coming to check on the success of his deed. "Why don't we just seize him now?" Watson asked. "We don't have enough proof yet, and he is too cunning. It is not what we know, Watson, it is what we can prove. If we make one false move, the villain may escape us yet." They worked their way down to the bottom of the slope so they could examine the body before Stapleton arrived. And as they drew closer, Holmes bent down and began to laugh. He stood up and danced a little. A bewildered Watson asked what had come over him, and Sherlock just said, "A beard! A beard! The man has a beard! It is not Henry!" Watson stooped down to look at the mangled face and discovered it was indeed Selden, the convict, wearing Sir Henry's clothes. And instantly, Watson remembered, on one of the first days at Baskerville Hall, Henry had given all of his old, unsquire-like clothing to Barrymore, and Barrymore must have given some of it to Selden. It was still a dark matter, but Watson felt better knowing this man had been condemned to death by the law, so in a way, he deserved it more than anyone else. Sherlock was still riding the high of realizing he had not failed yet. "The clothes were the poor devil's death," he exclaimed, explaining that the Hound has clearly been trained on the scent of Sir Henry's missing boot. Yet another mystery that he'd solved that Watson was just learning about. Then we get an interaction between the two that is just classic Sherlock and Watson. Sherlock says how his biggest question at this point is how a hardened criminal would risk recapture by screaming so terribly just because he heard a hound that he'd heard before. He must have known the Hound was hunting him. But how could he have possibly known that? Watson says his biggest question is why the Hound is out tonight. Stapleton must have only let it loose if he thought Henry would be out on the moor. And then we get this line from Sherlock. "My difficulty is the more formidable of the two, for I think we shall very shortly get an explanation of yours, while mine may remain a mystery forever." Basically saying, your question's pretty simple, and I'm sure we'll figure it out, but mine is more interesting because we may never know. I can just imagine Watson glaring at Sherlock's insolence when he said that. Just then, Stapleton's lantern was getting close. But before he arrived, Sherlock made sure Watson knew to not let on any level of suspicion around the man. Stapleton put on a good show when he arrived, saying he was surprised to see Watson out this late and then acting shocked to see a dead body. He knelt down by it with his lantern, and they could see the visible displeasure on his face when he realized it was not his target. Who is this?" he stammered. They tell him it's the escaped convict from Princetown. He was slow to wipe the shock off his face at the misfire, but eventually he put back on his mask of the friendly, animated entomologist and asked, "How could this have happened?" The detective and the doctor struggled to pretend like they didn't know this was all a game. Stapleton claimed he'd heard the screaming and came to see what had happened. He was concerned it might be Sir Henry. They asked him why he would think it was Sir Henry. "Because I had suggested he'd come visit me tonight," was the reply. And bingo, that was the answer to Watson's question. Sherlock's had been the more difficult after all. "What do you make of all this, Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" The detective bowed his head slightly and said that the man was very quick at identification, and Stapleton just said that they've been expecting him to show up at some point, and it seems he's arrived just in time to witness a tragedy. "Yes," Sherlock said, "I will take an unpleasant remembrance back to London with me tomorrow." "Oh, you return tomorrow?" Stapleton said. "That is the plan." Stapleton said he hoped the brief visit has cast some light on the situation, but Holmes shrugged his shoulders as if admitting he had learned nothing significant. "One cannot always have the success for which one hopes. An investigator needs facts, not legends or rumors. It has not been a satisfactory case." After covering up the body, they decide it could be left until morning, and they part ways. Stapleton back to Merripit House, Sherlock and Watson to Baskerville Hall. The next chapter is called Fixing the Nets, which does a great job of implying that it is a setup chapter. The action doesn't happen here, but important details are determined for the action that will come later. So let's get to those details and move to the climax, shall we? Sir Henry was, of course, shocked when Sherlock Holmes walked through the door. He was very glad to see him. When they walked in, the two men seemed to have been arguing. Watson had wanted to move on Stapleton immediately, but Sherlock said they didn't have the shadow of a case against him yet. They have to set a trap. "We must reconcile ourselves to the fact that we have no case at present, and that it is worth our while to run any risk in order to establish one." But once they came inside, they stopped talking about this, and they told Henry and the Barrymores about Selden's unfortunate death, which sent Mrs. Barrymore into tears. Henry remarked that he had almost gone out on the moor at the invitation of Stapleton, but at the last minute ignored the invite when he remembered the stern warning of not going out alone at night. Holmes dryly said that he has no doubt he would have had a more lively evening if he'd taken the invitation. They need to keep Sir Henry somewhat in the dark, but Holmes does let him know that he's putting a plan in motion, and it will be greatly aided if the baronet will follow instructions blindly. Holmes had just started explaining what he needed Henry to do when his eyes glanced over the squire's shoulders and he stopped mid-sentence. Watson followed his eyes to see that he was staring at the wall of portraits of the Baskerville line. "What is it?" Henry asked. Holmes shook himself from the stupor and said it was nothing. He was just a connoisseur of the art style used in the portraits. He asked if Henry knew the names of each ancestor. Henry started going down the row, naming each one, but Sherlock pointed at one in particular, a man dressed in black velvet and lace, and asked who that one was. "Ah," Henry said, "you should be made aware of him. That is the wicked Hugo, the causer of all this mischief. We'll never forget him." Watson looked at the portrait and back to Holmes, who seemed transfixed by it. Sherlock said they'd fill Henry in on the details later and that he should get some rest. Once the baronet was gone, Sherlock walked Watson to the portrait of Hugo and asked if he saw anything. Watson looked at the image. The plumed hat, the curly hair, the white lace collar. It looked like a portrait of a man of his time. Holmes grew impatient. He grabbed a chair to stand on and used one of his arms to cover up the hair and hat that really drew attention away from the face of the man. "Good heavens!" Watson cried out immediately. The face of Stapleton seemed to jump out at him. Sherlock is glad the point finally had come across to his friend, and says that he has trained himself to examine faces and not their trimmings. It's an important quality for a criminal investigator. So it became obvious that Stapleton was not a random criminal, but a potential heir to the inheritance who was trying to clear his path to lifelong wealth. "By tomorrow I think we can have him," Sherlock said, and then he suggested Watson get some sleep as well. The doctor was up early the next morning, but he found Holmes walking up the gravel driveway as if he'd already been out and about. He'd been to the village of Grimpen to send a few telegrams. Sir Henry walked up and asked for orders, as he'd promised to do whatever Holmes asked of him. But his countenance fell when he heard what the orders were. Sir Henry was to keep an engagement he'd already set to dine with the Stapletons that night, but he would go alone. Watson and Sherlock needed to head back to London, or at least that's what they told Sir Henry. Oh, and one more thing. Sir Henry should send his carriage back and walk home from the Stapletons. "You mean you want me to walk across the moor at night?" Henry said. "Precisely. But you told me never to do that. And now I'm telling you to do it this one time. I believe in you. It's critical that you do so." "Then I will do it," the brave young squire said. Watson was as surprised to hear all of this as Henry, and he couldn't conceive why it made sense to leave the man alone at this time. When the two men got to Coombe Tracey, there was a message waiting for Sherlock. Quote, "Wire received, coming with an unsigned warrant, arrive 5:40, Lestrade." Now, if you're not familiar with the Sherlock Holmes universe, Lestrade is the actual law enforcement in this world. He is a dutiful, maybe more or less clever man who has moments of tension with Sherlock's theatrical displays of deduction, but he is always what is used to actually arrest people when Sherlock catches them. So his presence is often part of the end of the story, if not during it. Their next stop was to visit Mrs. Laura Lyons again, and briefly put, they reveal to her that Stapleton is married, and she immediately flips on the man. She reveals that Stapleton had been the one who recommended she write to Sir Charles asking for help. And then he also was the reason she didn't keep the appointment. That he had told her, even though he himself was a poor man, he'd rather spend his last penny to help her divorce her husband so that they could be together than to ask a rich man for that assistance. And after she learned of the death of Sir Charles, Stapleton had acted like she should keep her letter under wraps to protect herself. Holmes promised her to just sit tight and that everything would be cleared up soon. They left, and Sherlock seemed to be buzzing with excitement. The net was tightening around Stapleton, but more importantly, this was the most fun he'd had on a case in a long time. The chapter ends with them at the train station receiving Lestrade. "Anything good?" he asked. "The biggest thing for years," said Holmes. "We have 2 hours before we need to think of starting. I think we might enjoy it in getting some dinner, and then, Lestrade, we will take the London fog out of your throat by giving you a breath of the pure night air of Dartmoor. Never been there? Ah, well, I don't suppose you will forget your first visit." Okay, one last diversion from the story before we get to the climax. It's time you get some quick and dirty details of our author, Arthur Conan Doyle, or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to you. I already talked about how he wanted to be done with Holmes after writing him for a few years, but this is more of just his personal backstory. And to start it off, I'm going to give you a few details that are going to make you think I just got lazy from the last author bio I did and copy-pasted it. So here goes. Arthur Doyle was a trained doctor who wanted to write fiction instead of practice medicine. Among his stories is a novel titled The Lost World, about an adventurer who believed that dinosaurs still roamed the earth in remote parts of South America. So, a trained doctor who wanted to be a writer, and one of his most popular works was a story about dinosaurs living in a contemporary time. Does this sound like Michael Crichton or what? But luckily for Doyle, he lived 100 years before Crichton, so I think he is the one who could point a finger at the copycat. Outside of writing, Doyle was an adventurous man. He served as a ship's doctor on a whaling voyage in the Arctic. He volunteered to be a medic during the Boer War between England and independent republics in southern Africa. He served in that war after killing Holmes off for the first time, by the way. It's almost as if he said, "I'm tired of writing wildly popular detective fiction. I'd rather go to a war front and tend to the wounded." What a guy. He did seem to enjoy writing, but he would occasionally get a twitch to do something bolder in his life. He was knighted, and I was surprised to learn it wasn't for his wild influence of Sherlock Holmes, but for a patriotic pamphlet he wrote during the Boer War called "The War in South Africa, Its Cause and Conduct." I guess you'll have more success winning titles from your government if you help it create propaganda, am I right? The last thing I wanted to share about him is that the epitaph on his grave says, "Steel true, blade straight." And I know that statement is vague in some ways, but the implications are so hardcore that I just have to applaud the confidence you have to have about how you lived your life to want that on your headstone. But all right, let's get to the conclusion of our story. Watson reflects during the day how one of Sherlock's greatest defects is his unwillingness to share his plans with other people. Some of it may be caution to make sure the plans don't leak, but there's definitely part of it which is simply his love of surprising everybody and his theatrical reveals. And that is how he found himself with Lestrade and Sherlock heading towards the moor after dark, still not knowing the plan beyond the fact that Sir Henry would be walking home alone from the Stapletons. They got out of their carriage at the turnoff that would lead to Merripit House, but they didn't want to get close enough to be seen. Lestrade remarked sarcastically that this seems like a very cheerful place, but Sherlock was in no mood for silliness and just asked everyone to walk on their toes and speak in no tone higher than a whisper. They crept up the terrain towards the house and got on top of a small rocky hillside that would put them above the yard. Once in position, they see that the drawing room windows are not covered, and so Watson is tasked with creeping up to the window for a look at what's going on inside. When he gets there, he sees two men sitting in the room, Henry and Stapleton. They were not facing the window, but they had cigars and coffee and seemed engaged in conversation. Jack Stapleton left Henry momentarily. The baronet continued puffing on his cigar in his solitude. Watson's heart jumped into his throat when he heard an exterior door open. He had very little around him to hide. Only the darkness provided him with any cover. He held his breath as he watched Stapleton walk to a shed in the corner of the yard. He fumbled in the darkness with a key and opened a lock on the door and entered. There was a scuffling noise from inside, and a minute later, Stapleton returned, locked the door, and rejoined his guest. Feeling confident he hadn't been spotted, Watson rejoined the other men on the rocky outlook. Holmes was curious to learn that Miss Beryl had not been with them. There appeared to be no other lights on in the house. Where could she be? But there was a new concern. A wall of fog was visible on the moor, and it was closing in on them. Holmes said this was the one thing that could possibly undo his plan, and he appeared anxious. Holmes rarely appeared anxious. For now, the sky was clear, and the stars and waning moon cast a dull scene in front of them. But within a short time, it might all be hidden behind a smoke screen, and they would be running blind. 15 minutes passed, and the first wisps of fog were reaching them. Sir Henry was still inside. It's decided they should head back to the road so that they are sure to be in position regardless of the fog, and they made it about a half-mile down from the house. As they waited, Holmes got more impatient, and at one point he put his ear to the ground and hissed that he thought he heard Sir Henry coming at last. And within moments the others heard the sounds of boots moving quickly on the stones of the road. The men were lying motionless off to the side in such dense fog that as long as they didn't move, there was no chance of Sir Henry seeing them. When he finally came into their limited view, there was a look of panic on Sir Henry's face. He seemed constantly to be looking over his shoulder. In less than 20 seconds, he was already out of view again, with only the sounds of his boots to be heard. Holmes hissed sharply, and Watson heard the crack of his pistol being cocked. "Look out," Holmes said. "It's coming." It started with the drumming patter of 4 paws pounding the road with more force than you would ever think could come from a dog. This was more like a horse at full gallop. Then, As the sound grew louder, a low, snarling growl was added to the mix. Watson stared with Holmes and Lestrade at the gray wall in front of them, waiting for the moment that whatever this thing was, it would finally make itself known to them. Watson's mind raced. He thought of the legend of Sir Hugo and his villainous deed that started this whole story. He thought of the yew alley and imagined poor Sir Charles running in terror until his heart burst. He thought of the wretched Selden running through a night like this from the very beast, only to fall to his death. Could it really be that fear-inducing? Could it be supernatural? Could this truly be a hound from hell? Holmes's eyes glittered with excitement and uncertainty. He himself could not know what he was about to see, but he looked forward to the unveiling. The three men reacted very differently when they first saw it. Holmes's lips parted in a smile of wicked fascination. Lestrade dropped to the ground, covering his head. Watson gripped his pistol tightly, but he was too paralyzed to move. It was a hound. Massive, coal-black, and nothing like any earthly beast. Its jaws gaped wide, and fire spilled from between its fangs with every breath. Its eyes also burned like twin furnaces glaring through the fog. Flame licked along its muzzle, even dripping from the loose flesh of its throat. No nightmare-fevered brain could summon anything more savage, more unholy. Out of the shifting wall of mist it surged, this towering shape, this demon hound, its face a vision of pure hell breaking loose upon the earth. All three men were frozen by fear or astonishment, and the beast had already passed beyond them before they came to their senses. The sounds of the monster tearing after Sir Henry finally brought them to. Holmes and Watson fired their guns into the fog blindly. There was a hideous howl sound from the beast, but it wasn't down. It kept running, so they took off in hot pursuit. As they ran, the fog thinned ever so slightly, just enough that as they chased the brutish dog, Sir Henry came into view. He was looking backwards at the hound, his face white as a sheet. Watson was a pretty athletic man for his age, but Holmes outsprinted him as the beast closed in on Henry. There was a deep roar from the black fiend as it leapt onto the man, knocking him down, the jaws going for the throat. But before it could tear with its ferocious teeth, Holmes emptied 5 rounds from his revolver into the body. The fiery mouth gnashed at the air as the body toppled to the ground, its giant paws flailing as the final breaths coursed through its lungs. The roars had faded to a dying whimper. Watson pressed his gun to the monster's head, but he didn't ever need to pull the trigger. It was already gone. Sir Henry checked himself for wounds and breathed a prayer of gratitude when he realized he was unharmed. Lestrade was busy swigging from his brandy flask with a shaky hand. Holmes was using the barrel of his pistol to poke at the corpse of the dog. "It's dead, whatever it is," he said. "We've laid the family ghost once and forever." It truly was a massive creature. It was some savage combination of a bloodhound and a mastiff. It was more like a small lion in terms of its size. Even in death, there seemed to be bluish flame dripping from its mouth and around its eyes. Watson pressed his finger onto the glowing muzzle, and then he looked at his finger, now also gleaming blue in the darkness, and all he said was, "Phosphorus." "A very clever preparation of it," Holmes said. "No odor which might have interfered with the beast's sense of smell." After everything, the legend, the witnesses, the dead bodies, it really had been just a big, ugly brute of a dog with a scientific parlor trick added to the myth. Holmes then apologized to Henry for having used him as bait. He had anticipated a dog, but nothing as enormous or monstrous as this, and the fog had complicated everything. "You saved my life," Henry said. "Having endangered it first," Sherlock said sheepishly. He then tells Henry to make his way home. He should be safe now, but his nerves were too shot to be of use to them. They had to go after Stapleton. They knew he would have heard the gunshots and would have known the game was up, and so he certainly wouldn't have gone home, but they decided to start by checking his house anyway. The front door of Merripit House was open. They rushed inside, shocking the elderly servants who didn't know what was going on. They searched every room until Lestrade found a locked door on one of the bedrooms. "Someone's in here," he yelled. "I can hear movement." They broke the door open to find no sign of their villain, but instead, they found Mrs. Stapleton bound and tied to an upright support beam in the center of the room. When they untied her, she sank to the floor in relief. She had signs of whiplash on her neck and bruises all over that marked other evidence of physical abuse. "Is he safe?" she gasped. "He will not escape us, madam," Sherlock said. "No, I don't mean my husband. Is Sir Henry safe?" "Yes, he is." "And the hound?" "It's dead." She sighed in relief. She goes on to reveal to them that she has endured abuses physical, mental, and psychological at the hands of this man for their entire marriage. She then tells them there is only one place he would have gone, the center of the Grimpen mire. Remember when Stapleton told Watson all of those chapters ago that he was the only man who knew how to get to the center of it safely? Turns out that was because he had been keeping the dog out there at an abandoned tin mine in the middle of it, and it served as a secret lair for all of his wicked deeds. She revealed there were guiding wands that marked the path that would be hard to notice if you didn't know what to look for. But in this fog, even Stapleton wouldn't be able to see them. It's agreed that there was no point in risking their lives to chase him into the mire in that dense of fog, so Lestrade was left in charge of Merripit House. Holmes and Watson returned to Baskerville Hall to check on Henry, who, from the stress on his nerves, broke into a delirious fever that very night. The next morning, they left him in the care of Dr. Mortimer, picked up Lestrade, and entered the mire. Mrs. Stapleton went them at the beginning just to show them what to look for, so she could help them catch her evil husband. They got a sense of how miserable her life had been, to see how gleeful she was in bringing his reign of terror to an end. They followed the markers deeper into the mire. The mire was rank with decaying plants and slimy water. The air was thick with foul odors. At different times, one of the men would take a misstep and land thigh deep in the muck, but his companions would quickly pull him out. No step was on sure ground as the mud sucked at their boots. And speaking of boots, they noticed something in the mire, which made Sherlock sink down to his waist in order to retrieve it. It was a boot with the label, Myers, Toronto. "Worth it," Sherlock said as he climbed back out, muddy and soaking wet. "We have finally found Sir Henry's lost boot." "Thrown by Stapleton as he fled?" Watson asked. "Exactly," said Sherlock. There was no point looking for footprints in the bog. The mud rose and fell too fast to hold any shape. So when they finally made it through to the other side, they were eager to pick up the tracks of the villain, but there were no tracks to be found. The only story they could come up with was that Stapleton had not passed safely in that fog. His tyranny ended in the mire that night. They continued on to the abandoned mine where there were several signs of the man's work. Most haunting was the large iron stake driven into the ground with a thick chain attached to it. The lonely prison where the horrible dog had moaned its pained and lonely cry over the moor those nights. "He could hide the hound, but he could not hush the voice," Sherlock said as he shook his head at the barbaric treatment of the hound. There was a tin with a paste they could identify as the phosphorus mixture used to make the hound truly hellish. And Sherlock reasons he kept the dog here unless he intended to use it on any given night, in which case he would move it to the shed on his property. A pretty slick way to create a living legend to terrorize the locals. No wonder Sir Charles's heart had burst. No wonder Selden had run screaming. Anyone would lose any sensibility they had if they saw that phantom beast charging at them. I said it in London, Watson, and I'll say it again. Never before have we dealt with a more dangerous man than the one who now belongs to the mire. The book ends with a chapter called A Retrospection. It's basically a way for the author to tie up all the loose ends of the case, framed as a conversation between Sherlock and Watson. It had been weeks since the case had wrapped up, and Sherlock had already solved several petty cases that were not nearly as interesting as the Hound of the Baskervilles. But the topic came up one evening between the two of them because they'd met up with Henry and Dr. Mortimer earlier. The two men were heading out on a trip to try and recover Henry's nerves. Sherlock had talked with Mrs. Stapleton a couple times since that night and had filled in a lot of the missing details. He believes he has a full picture of what took place. Watson asked him to sketch it out for him to hear. Then Sherlock has a line that spoke to me so deeply. Quote, "Certainly, though I cannot guarantee that I carry all the facts in my mind, intense mental concentration has a curious way of blotting out what has passed." Guys, I deal with that on this show so much. You ask me a question about a story I'm working on or the episode I just released, I could probably tell you what the author ate for breakfast the day they finished the book. But you ask me a question about something I said in an episode 6 months ago, I may not be able to even remember it as something I said. I spend so much energy getting into my current story, it's as if I have to push out stuff from previous stories to make room. But anyway, Sherlock, who has a much better memory than I do, gives a pretty good account. Here are the bullet points. Stapleton was indeed the son of the black sheep brother Roger Baskerville, who had been banished to South America, the one who had been thought to not have any children. He had married Beryl Garcia, a fair-skinned but exotic beauty from Costa Rica, and then legally changed his name to Vandeleur before moving back to England, where they established their school. When the school went under, they changed their name again to Stapleton and took the money they had left and moved to the south of England. Knowing his lineage, Stapleton had done his research and discovered that only 2 men stood between him and the Baskerville fortune. And although there isn't a clear picture of how his plan formed, it definitely started when he decided to have his wife pretend to be his sister so he could use her as a decoy. So they moved to Dartmoor. He became friends with his estranged uncle so he could establish himself as a trustworthy neighbor. Having grown up in the Americas, he had never heard the legend of the Hound until Sir Charles told it to him, and his plan took shape. He bought the biggest, vilest dog he could find and snuck it onto the mire. But it took a long time for him to get a chance at killing his uncle. The old man would never leave the grounds at night. Stapleton had tried several times to just lurk around the hall in the dark with the Hound, but he never had any luck. But those attempts were when we got the stories of peasants swearing they had seen a demon dog. He had hoped his wife might lure Sir Charles to his ruin, but she would not agree to do something so ugly. Even physical abuse from her husband did not get her to change her mind. Then the situation with Laura Lyons gave him a chance to get Charles out of his house at night. The beast must have leapt over the U-gate with its fiery paint job and chased Sir Charles to his death, but the dog didn't approach the body, likely having been able to smell that he was no longer alive. "The cunning of it!" Sherlock exclaimed. "His only accomplice could never give him away." His wife knew some of his designs, and she knew the Hound existed, but she could never have conceived just how devious his plans were. When Stapleton learned of the arrival of the only other heir from Canada, he tried to scare him away in London. Not trusting his wife left alone, he dragged her to London as well and kept her locked up in the hotel room, while he stalked Henry and Mortimer with his fake beard. Mrs. Stapleton, of course, wrote the note and used newspaper clippings so that if it fell into her husband's hands, she couldn't be linked to it. And of course, the stolen boots were Stapleton as well. The first one was too new and didn't have enough of his scent on it, so the second boot was taken. Sherlock asks Watson if he remembers how much attention he had given to the actual paper the note had been made on, and says that it was because he could smell a perfume on it, indicating the involvement of a woman. So between the man in the carriage and the woman who sent the note, Sherlock had already suspected the Stapletons among the list of neighbors before Watson ever left London. And that brings us to when Sherlock secretly came to Devonshire. Watson's reports, which were immediately forwarded from London, were very useful to him in piecing together the facts. Quote, "By the time you discovered me upon the moor, I had complete knowledge of the whole business, but I had not a case which could go to jury. Even Stapleton's attempt upon Sir Henry the night which ended in the death of the unfortunate convict did not help us much in proving murder against our man. There seemed to be no alternative but to catch him red-handed." Watson knew how the rest played out, but he had one question. How would Stapleton have claimed the inheritance if he'd succeeded? If he revealed himself to be an heir after living close to the 2 dead baronets, it would raise suspicion. Sherlock had an answer to that too. Mrs. Stapleton had heard her husband discuss the problem on several occasions. There were 3 possible courses. He might claim the property from South America, establishing his identity before the British authorities there, so to obtain the fortune without ever coming to England at all. Or he might adopt an elaborate disguise during the short time that he needed to be in London. Or again, he might furnish an accomplice with the proofs and papers putting him in as the heir and retaining a claim upon some portion of his income. We cannot doubt from what we know of him that he would have found some way out of the difficulty. But with that, Sherlock says there's nothing more to be said about that case, and after so many weeks of hard work, they deserve a break. He has tickets to the opera and a reservation at Marcini's for dinner. "Can you be ready in half an hour?" he asked his friend. Just another day in the life of the world's greatest detective, am I right? Before we get to the lesson, I'm going to do my normal plug here that if you haven't given the show 5 stars yet, please take the 15 seconds it takes to do that. Also, a reminder that we have a premium tier subscription where you get extended versions of the story episodes, as well as all the character analysis episodes. Plus, I'm starting to look for ways to add even more content to that tier because I want to make sure you're getting as much value as I can give you. We'll discuss one of those ideas at the end of this episode. And finally, there is the free newsletter, School of Protagonism, where I explore more of the ideas behind living a life based on the rules that create great stories and characters. Links to everything I just said in the episode description. But the real plug is just to remind you that as we enter October, if you are new to the show, last year's Halloween episodes are among my absolute favorites to this day. Frankenstein, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Dracula, they're all just hanging out, waiting for you to go listen or re-listen if you're an OG. By the way, I realized after I had recorded the Arrival episode that I lied when I said that it was the first short story I'd covered. Sleepy Hollow is 100% a short story. Okay, all that stuff is out of the way now. Let's talk takeaways. I'm going to make a bold declaration that may strike some of you as odd or wrong, but in the next few minutes, I'm fairly confident I'll bring you over to my side. So here goes. Sherlock Holmes is an empath. Now, put down your pitchforks and listen. Yes, Sherlock Holmes, the cold and somewhat autistic-seeming detective, the man in the stories where oftentimes the humor comes from him saying things that are cold or unfeeling to people who are more sensitive, is an empath. I stand by that. Here's the key to understanding why I'm right. If I were to oversimplify things, I think I could say that most people hear the word empathy and they react in one of two ways. Either they say, that's a necessary quality for an evolved human being, or they say, that's soft. So both groups might hear me say Sherlock is an empath and not like the sound of it because to the first, Sherlock is far too uncaring and accidentally cruel at times. And to the second, the idea of the brilliant protagonist being soft doesn't sit right. But empathy is so much more than that, and it's about time we started discussing this. The truth is, from my research, the history of meaning behind the word empathy is super messy. For example, yes, it sounds Greek, and there is a Greek word empatheia, but that's not the term we are thinking of. That relates more to just feeling intense emotions. The English word empathy actually has roots to a translation of a German word, Einfühlung. The psychologist who used empathy to describe Einfühlung defined it as this: a process of humanizing objects or reading or feeling ourselves into them. Which, even that is a messy concept for us to try and use to pin down what empathy means in the 21st century, but it does make a key distinction that is kind of where we've settled at in modern psychology. The key is the or. The fact that what we've called empathy for some time actually has two different paths that we don't discuss equally. The terminology psychologists use today to distinguish between them are emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Now, emotional empathy is where most people's minds go when they think of the word. It involves not only understanding what someone feels, but feeling it with them. This is seen as positive because it allows for trust building and bonding between people when they feel validated that you understand how I feel because I can see that you are feeling it too. Now, my instincts may not tell me that that is bad, but there is one guy who has made it his mission to prove that unchecked emotional empathy is a net negative. Paul Bloom wrote a book called Against Empathy, and I'm not going to dive too deep because, as you can probably guess, we're going to focus on cognitive empathy. But just as a quick primer for why emotional empathy isn't a perfect ideal, Bloom argues that emotional empathy leads to zooming in on individuals instead of focusing on the larger group. It also leads to more extreme tribalism, where we show extreme empathy for people in our tribe only to discount those outside of it. That could be because emotional empathy is draining. It can lead to emotional burnout, so we choose to limit who we feel empathy for because we cannot deal with the idea of feeling it for everyone. Okay, there's that. Let's talk about cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy just means that you can understand another person's perspective. It is also referred to as perspective taking. It is basically the old idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. There is no requirement to drain your emotional tank to reproduce what the other person is thinking. Simply to be able to connect the dots as to why they feel the way they do. From there, you could apply what Bloom calls rational compassion, which is the helpful response that people associate with empathy, but it comes from a place of reason rather than just being swept up in the emotions of another person. And rational compassion is what Sherlock is lacking. He has heaps of cognitive empathy, but zero rational compassion. There's no need to dive into that aspect here. If I can, I'm going to release a YouTube video specifically about that distinction soon, but let's finally bring this back to my initial claim. Sherlock is an empath, a cognitive empath, a crucial trait of a detective, therapist, psychologist, or anyone who makes a living by trying to understand why people do the things they do, is cognitive empathy. The ability to look at someone's choices, feelings, ideas, and intellectually be able to get to that place without having to share that worldview. To be able to get outside of, I wouldn't do that, or that doesn't make sense to me, it means that your starting assumption with anyone you meet is whatever this person does makes sense to them, and it is your job to try to piece together how. In fact, I would go as far as to say it is a childish person who cannot get outside of, I wouldn't do that, or I don't think that way. That is a crippling place to be in because your entire worldview is confined to your tiny little world. Accepting that there are opinions, beliefs, and more importantly, wisdom outside of yourself opens up a massive amount of potential for you. But back to Sherlock. He employed cognitive empathy in order to get inside the minds of suspects. To theorize plausible motives, he spent a considerable amount of time trying to live in the minds of other people to make sense of what they did. What sets him apart is his ability to apply the statistical probabilities, like we talked about earlier, on top of this level of conceiving why someone might act the way they do. Now, this is not a conclusive discussion on cognitive empathy. It has so much upside, especially for people who have avoided empathy in general because it felt soft. There could be downsides as well, however. It can lead you to over-normalizing bad behavior because you get why they do it. In the hands of a bad person, the skill can allow them to manipulate people. It can also lead to burnout because you find yourself analyzing everything. It is not a magic pill to a perfect life, but it is a highly valuable skill that doesn't get talked about enough. Just because you can understand why someone acts the way they do, it doesn't mean you endorse the action. It doesn't mean you feel the same way they do, but it means you have an honest understanding of the environment you are playing in. For Sherlock, understanding a villain's motives allowed him to better predict their next moves. It also allowed him to deduce where they might dig up new leads. In this specific Sherlock Holmes story, maybe the greatest case of cognitive empathy was his acknowledgement from the start that this was the most formidable foe he had gone up against. By respecting Stapleton's intelligence, he didn't think of him like just another evildoer, but he opened his mind to possibilities of new challenges and more difficult clues to piece together than normal. What does cognitive empathy look like in my life? I can hear you asking. I'm glad you spoke up. Here are some possible examples. If you work in sales, cognitive empathy can help you clearly pin down what matters to your customer, allowing you to present a deal that is not only agreeable, but desirable to them. Whenever you deal with conflict in your life, cognitive empathy can allow you to express to the other party that you understand their position. Because explaining the feelings that they're having accurately back to them is way more influential than just saying, I get where you're coming from. Or when you find yourself in a room full of strangers, this practice can help you identify quickly the people who you may have a strong connection with while separating the ones that may just want to get to know you to take advantage of you for their purposes. But I think one of the greatest examples where this is helpful is in becoming more resilient when people act hostile towards you. Cognitive empathy gives you the power to assess what about their situation might make them lash out at you. So rather than reacting right back to them, you show strength by not being goaded into yelling back at them just because they yelled at you. The applications are kind of endless, honestly. It is a complete reframe of how your mind works. But as Holmes so clearly demonstrates for us, empathy doesn't mean you have to feel what others feel, but rather just understanding how they could end up feeling that way. And if you can learn to understand how people experience the world differently from you, it can become a superpower, just like it was for Sherlock. And that does it for The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Protagonists, today I've got stuff I find highly interesting, like what were the influences on the creation of the character of Sherlock Holmes? There's more on understanding the psychology of horror. Why are we so drawn to it? And specifically, I want to dive into what's so special about a story like this, where we actually knew who the villain was with chapters still to go, but the tension is still very high. Spoiler, it involves an idea from Alfred Hitchcock. So y'all stick around. If you want to sign up for the Protagonist Edition, link is in the episode description. The last thing before we sign off, a little preview for this month. I always love to go hard in the paint in October, so I will be releasing not only a mini episode, but another novel before Halloween. And for Protagonist listeners, there will probably be 1 or 2 additional mini episodes where I just read a spooky short story I have come to love and share a few thoughts on it. It's going to be a busy month. But for now, thanks for following along with Becoming the Main Character. If you keep showing up to listen, I can promise I'll keep showing up with the greatest fiction ever written, so we can see the ways they teach us about a better life. I'm Jamison Molson, saying thank you for being a listener. Until next time. But also, go listen to Frankenstein again, because it's that good.